Hey guys, tonight we're headed to the quiet cobblestone streets of Maastricht, where the air always smells faintly of old wood, dry bricks, and something vaguely floral, like a window box that's never overwatered. It's early morning, the kind of early where the light hasn't made any firm decisions yet. Just leaking slowly in like a lazy sigh. You're walking past rows of tall, narrow houses, each with shutters folded tightly like sleeping wings. No cars yet. Just the echo of your footsteps and the rustle of a bird deciding whether it's worth getting up today. You glance up and notice the first flutter of life, a hand reaching out through a second-floor window. Fingers pressing lightly on the outer latch of a wooden shutter. It clicks once, gently, like an old watch closing. That's how the day begins here, not with alarms, but adjustments. This story might spark your curiosity, or just put you gently to sleep. Either way, I'm glad you're here. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and the local time in the comments. I love seeing where everyone's tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand across from a long brick facade where 5 windows in a row all have their shutters open to exactly the same angle. 30 degrees, not quite wide enough to let in gossip, but just enough to say, yes, we're awake, but not available. You'll see that angle again. It's the most popular one. It's not random, either. The shutter charts are real, hand-drawn. Usually, or printed in small booklets with cloth covers and brass corners. You'll find them in desk drawers or hanging inside pantries. Sometimes laminated, if someone got ambitious. Most are dated. Issued 1947, revised 1953, amended autumn, 62. The Dutch don't joke about adjustments. Or, they do, but very dryly. You walk into a small home, hypothetically, of course, and you find the manual resting by the window crank. It's a single folded chart, about the size of a tea towel. Smudged at the edges and dog-eared to section 3. The top reads, in fine calligraphy, chart for shutter adjustment under common and coastal conditions. Underneath that, a grid. Columns for time of day. Rows for season. Each cell contains a degree suggestion, 15 degrees. 35 degrees. 70 degrees. No explanations, just numbers. You're meant to know what they mean. One factual detail. The 1951 Standardized Home Light Entry Ordinance, issued by the Provincial Board of Limburg, listed acceptable shutter angles for north and south-facing windows, with a strict upper limit of 82 degrees to avoid external window encroachment beyond the facade line. Which is a very Dutch way of saying, don't stick out too far. But even with rules like that, people made it personal. Some marked their charts with thumbtacks or pressed violets. One woman you imagine still tapes a small piece of cotton thread across her chart, stretched taut across her preferred reading light angle. You run a finger along the edge of a shutter, again, hypothetically, and feel the groove where hundreds of fingertips have done the same. That little notch near the hinge? Not decorative, that's a wear cue, an unofficial calibration mark. If you twist until you hear the latch creak at that point, you're probably at 45 degrees. Probably. There's an outdated note scribbled in the margin. Do not adjust while cowbells ring. No one remembers why. Maybe something to do with echoes? Maybe just someone being poetic. Someone across the street has a different rhythm. Their shutters creak open slower. One click at a time. You know it's deliberate. Their manual probably says, begin with a partial open, reassess after coffee. Another window stays closed. Heavy curtains instead. Probably someone who never followed the charts. Never folded theirs neatly. Never oiled their latches with clove-scented beeswax. But that's okay. Not every house believes in open secrets. As you walk, the neighborhood unfolds like origami. One house has shutters painted moss green. The next, a faded ochre. Some cracked, some pristine, each with its own story, whispered through tilt and tension. And then you spot the rarest thing of all. A shutter with a lock. Not a latch. A proper brass keyhole and all. That's not in the manual. That's a statement. An unresolved mystery. No one knows who wrote the first shutter adjustment chart. Some say it was a Delft carpenter with too much time. Others say it was a Protestant pastor obsessed with optical modesty. The truth? Probably both. Or neither. But the charts remain. You rest a hand on the sill and breathe in. There's lavender somewhere. And warm wood. And the metallic tang of a latch that's seen more mornings than most people. The light shifts slightly. You watch it bend across the brick. Catch on the corner of a shutter. And stretch across the ground like a sundial's whisper. And just like that, the chart's first suggestion has expired. The day has moved forward. The window opens just a little wider. You linger a while longer by the window, letting the light settle around you like a patient old dog. Across the street, a second-story shutter groans slightly as it opens another notch. No rush. No need for precision, but you recognize the rhythm. That's the 10:15 adjustment window. Mid-spring protocol. The chart would say, adjust to 42 degrees. In less full sun, then ease to 47 degrees. Of course, nobody really says 42 degrees aloud. They say, just past the elbow. Or, until the shade brushes the tile seam. Or, in one particularly poetic household, until the cat stops squinting. You reach into your pocket, again, hypothetically, and pull out your own copy of the manual. The pages are soft. The cover worn to a faded gray. The spine cracked just enough to open naturally to Section 5, Adjustments for Wistful Weather. This section is rarely consulted. Mostly because no one's ever sure if today counts as wistful. But if the clouds are slow and puffy, and the breeze smells like rain that never comes, well, you might just be in wistful territory. The procedural detail here is simple. On wistful days, shutters must remain in the 35 degrees to 50 degrees range. To preserve a sense of interior melancholy without fully surrendering to it. That's a direct quote. No one's quite sure if it was meant as a joke. Or if the writer was just having an existential Tuesday. You imagine a kitchen where the light lands softly on a wooden countertop. Someone slicing bread, the sound muted by linen curtains. A shutter tilts open just enough to frame the handle of a watering can on the sill. Its metal blooming with early rust. The quiet is not just silence, it's curated. Built, bracketed, slotted into place like the shutters themselves. Then there's the sound, the faint metallic click of a catch disengaging. That's a morning sound, but it's also an afternoon sound. Depending on how closely you follow the schedule. The click changes tone with temperature. On colder days, it's a crisper pop. On humid days, it leans toward a low thunk. Most locals can tell the time of year by the resonance alone. You pass a doorway with a laminated chart pinned just inside the frame. It's sun-bleached and protected by a single piece of cracked plastic. The heading reads, Adjustments approved by the Civic Panel on Visual Harmony. Maastricht Division, 1956. Below that, a chart broken into narrow bands, morning tilt, midday foldback, and evening seal. This chart includes a now-defunct setting known as the reflective pause, a position where shutters are tilted slightly upward. Meant to reflect late sunlight onto ceiling beams for contemplative thought or mid-afternoon snoozes. No one does it anymore. Too fussy. But the chart remains. You hear a window creak open behind you and glance back in time to see someone flick a small tassel attached to their shutter latch. That's a legacy quirk from the early 1930s. During a short-lived trend, some households tied color-coded tassels to indicate intention, green for fresh air welcome, blue for watching the street, and red for do not disturb unless you have cheese. Only the cheese one ever caught on. Your hypothetical self climbs a narrow staircase to the attic room of a tall, thin house. Here, the shutters are smaller, square rather than long, and the hinge is reversed. A rare left pivot. The manual suggests a 55 degrees angle at sunrise, narrowing to 25 degrees by late morning. The adjustment is meant to prevent sun bleaching of stored fabrics. But you suspect no one's moved the old blanket chest beneath the window in decades. You open the shutter gently and look down on the street. From this angle, the entire neighborhood tilts slightly left. It's not the architecture, it's the shutters, each one angled by preference, weather, and habit. Together, they form a kind of accidental mosaic. There's an open-ended note in the manual's margin, in rare cases. If light reflects off the cobblestones and strikes the shutter edge at just the right hour, a thin band of gold will appear. No one has ever confirmed this. But then again, no one's denied it either. Back downstairs, someone sets a kettle on the stove. The lid clinks once, just as a shutter on the house across the alley swings fully open, an unusual move. Full opens are reserved for 3 circumstances: drying curtains, welcoming guests, or post-argument catharsis. You smile. That one's probably the third. And then there's the humming. It starts low and soft, a neighbor, somewhere out of sight, humming a tune without structure. A kind of melody-shaped mumble. And yet, even this sounds like part of the system. You can almost imagine the manual recommending, optional, add 1 hum during 3rd position alignment for acoustic warmth. Another house has painted their shutters a deep indigo. The paint worn thin along the outer edges where fingers press. The paint itself is made from ultramarine pigment, a nod to tradition. Perhaps. Or maybe just a clearance sale. Either way, it casts a gentle, moody tint on the white curtains behind it. At the edge of the neighborhood, where the brick gives way to cobblestone gardens, there's a tiny cottage with shutters painted with small sunbursts, 1 on each corner. This was not approved by the civic panel. But it has endured, mostly because the owner baked very persuasive pies during the review meeting. There's another procedural quirk here: shutters must close before 10 p.m., unless weather conditions or national holidays dictate otherwise. Exceptions include open-air concerts, unusually late flower deliveries, and moments of rare celestial clarity. The last one is never defined, but it shows up on every version of the manual after 1949. You walk past another row of houses, each more modest than the last. A few have shutters permanently stuck at odd angles, victims of age or rust. The owners simply paint them where they are. Frozen gestures, quiet sculptures. The wind shifts again. It carries the scent of beeswax and old stone. And you hear the smallest creak. Just behind you, someone is adjusting again, not urgently, not anxiously, just because it's that time. You follow the path into a narrower lane, where the houses lean a little closer together and the shutters are tucked in like folded arms. It's quieter here, partly because the street narrows sound itself, but mostly because this is a zone of deeper shade, and shaded shutters don't get as much attention. They don't demand it. You pass a window where someone's placed a ceramic pot on the sill, faint blue glaze. Just beginning to craze. The shutter beside it is barely open, tilted at a shy 15 degrees. That's what the chart refers to as the whisper angle, designed for indirect ventilation on days when the interior mood is uncertain. It's often used during arguments, mid-nap transitions, or when you're not entirely sure if that delivery was meant for you. Inside the manual, buried in Appendix C, which most people skip, is a procedural clarification. Whisper angle shutters should only be used on lower levels, to avoid creating dissonant reflections against upper-story panes. It's an aesthetic consideration, more than a structural one, but still underlined twice in blue ink. The chart in question was first proposed in the late 1940s by the Municipal Committee on Functional Charm, a short-lived body that also tried to regulate the shape of stairwell rugs. They failed in that regard, but the shutter guidance stuck. Just up ahead, you notice a house with mismatched shutters, one pale saffron, the other a deep teal. It's not an oversight. It's the result of an inherited home, where one side was repainted by a daughter who loved order, and the other preserved by a father who believed in tradition. The story is known in this neighborhood. Some call it the House of Compromise, and some just call it pretty. You glance toward the hinges. They've been replaced recently, brass, polished, a little too bright. The procedural detail, per the 1952 amendment, is that any hinge replacement should be accompanied by a minimum 30-day weathering period before reclassification of color harmony. Not everyone follows that. This house clearly didn't. A soft wind runs along the alley, and you spot a shutter propped open with a tiny carved wedge. It's shaped like a bird, probably hand-whittled. That wedge is a legacy trick during seasonal transitions, when temperatures swing wildly across a single day. Some residents use custom props to hold shutters at awkward midpoints. The manual doesn't encourage it. But it never forbids it either. There's a note that simply reads, in transitional seasons. The line between precision and personality may blur. You move on. Further along. A window is entirely shutterless, exposed. Curtainless. Raw. It's not broken. It's a choice. A rare one. Occasionally, a house simply gives up the system, preferring open light or permanent clarity. These homes are rare and generally regarded with cautious respect. You pause to wonder whether it's a new owner or an old defector returning to the neighborhood. There's an open-ended footnote in one of the older editions. The absence of shutters may be read as protest. Freedom, or aesthetic liberation, or just a budgetary choice. All are valid. Probably. You lean against a stone post and watch a shutter swing gently in the wind. Creaking in rhythm. The sound is hypnotic. There's no urgency to it. No threat. Just movement for movement's sake. This is a forgotten joy, watching something do its job at its own pace. Then, behind a fence draped with ivy, you glimpse a shutter clearly rigged with a string pull system. It runs from the latch to a series of hooks nailed into the inner frame, finally ending in a worn loop near the doorway. This is a classic, distant disengage, setup. Once used by households with early risers who didn't want to enter chilly rooms just to open the shutters. Pull the loop, and the latch flicks open. There's a procedural description in the 1947 supplement. The cord must be cotton wrapped, tension balanced, and mounted with no fewer than 3 secure anchor points. But of course, most systems now are improvisations. The string you see is frayed jute, probably scavenged from an old market sack. You smile. One house has tiny painted dots at the edge of each shutter, barely visible. But uniform. You count 3 per panel. This is a forgotten labeling system from a now-defunct housing cooperative. Each dot denoted something: insulation level, recommended daily open time, or, according to some, how many times the house cat had slept on the windowsill. No one knows for sure. The manual refers to this only in a handwritten margin note. See code clarification. Pending 1959 draft, never published. A voice calls faintly from an upper window, someone asking if it's time yet. You imagine them not looking at the clock, but instead at the wall, at the light crawling slowly toward a certain brick. When the shadow crosses it, the shutters move, because time here doesn't tick. It leans. You see a tall, narrow building with one shutter clearly jammed at half angle. It's wedged by paint, swollen from rain or a humid night. Instead of fixing it, the owner has attached a small wooden sign, currently embracing the imperfect. A bit of charm, a bit of defiance. You chuckle. The manual wouldn't approve, but it might smile, if books could do that. In another window, a small cloth is draped across the inner sill, held in place by the shutter itself. A makeshift sun filter, not regulation, but common. The cloth is stitched with faint letters, something in Dutch you can't quite read. Possibly a poem. Possibly laundry instructions. Either way, it glows softly in the afternoon light. You pause a long time here, letting the silence fill up with gentle sound, letting your breath match the rhythm of fabric moving, letting the chart fall away into memory for a moment. You walk on, still tracing the line of old shutters, still following the quiet rhythm they create, those modest wooden rectangles with their hinges and slats and stories. There's one ahead that draws your eye immediately, not because of its color or condition, but because of the little bell hanging from its lower corner. A bell, just small enough to ring in a breeze, tied with a strip of faded gingham cloth. It's not in any manual, definitely not in the charts, but it's there, singing softly in the wind. A legacy practice, once used by elderly residents who wanted an auditory reminder when the wind direction shifted. The bell's tone would change slightly, with the air's movement. The idea was to adjust the shutter not by sun or temperature, but by sound. In the 1950 edition of the Shutter Chart Manual, specifically in Section 5, Peripheral Indicators and Addenda, there's a curious footnote: supplemental devices, such as auditory or olfactory triggers, are not prohibited, but discouraged due to calibration inconsistency. That was the polite way of saying, bells are for the romantic, not the rigorous. But still, the bell rings. Next to it, The shutter itself is held in place by a unique mechanism, a lever brace cut from old cutlery. The handle of a dinner fork has been flattened, bent, and nailed to the frame, forming a clasp that pivots into position. It's not pretty, but it works. That's the thing about shutter culture. The charts and manuals may prescribe exact angles, materials, and seasonal variations, but the users, well, they innovate, especially when they run out of parts or patience. A procedural instruction from the 1943 wartime addendum actually encouraged improvisation during shortages. Households may adopt alternative bracketing systems during periods of material rationing, provided they meet minimum stability requirements and do not pose threat to passerby. Fork brackets definitely count. As you pass another home, you notice a shutter painted with faint, abstract stripes, 2 tones of gray, neither of which match the house. A curious choice, but when you look closer, you see what it really is: shadow memory. The paint has faded around the iron window grating inside. The shutter only ever opens halfway. The same halfway, over decades. And so the iron pattern, baked in sunlight and etched in dust, has ghosted its shape into the shutter's outer surface. It's beautiful, unintended, and entirely unrepeatable. There's no mention of this in the charts. No guideline for patterns acquired through habitual restraint. But maybe there should be. You continue, now noticing how many shutters have character not from their function, but from their wear. One is chipped in the bottom left corner, deep enough to expose the raw wood beneath the paint. The mark is oddly clean. You suspect a dog, or maybe the toe of a hurried boot. The mystery lingers. An open-ended note in the appendix titled, Accidental Identifiers, reads, "Physical marks that do not compromise structure may become culturally or sentimentally significant. Repair is optional." That's about as poetic as the manual gets. Another window has twin shutters, each with a single hole bored through the upper panel, roughly the size of a marble. You assume they were once peepholes, or vents, or possibly for passing string through. No one knows. The holes have been filled with small wooden plugs, each carved with a different initial. 1M, 1B. The origins of this system are undocumented. There's a procedural suggestion buried in the 1961 draft, never ratified, wherever functional openings exist. They should be neutralized with uniform filler. But no one really cared by then. People were personalizing shutters with carvings, initials, poems, and pressed flowers under lacquer. The manual never caught up. You pause by a corner house that stands slightly off-grid. Its shutters don't match the street alignment. They're set a few degrees off, rotated just enough that when they open, they catch sun earlier or later than expected. Some say it was built that way on purpose, to avoid direct glare at certain hours. Others say the brickwork simply sagged, and no one ever fixed the angles. You read once in an archived editorial footnote, angular dissonance may be tolerated provided that the aesthetic flow of the block is preserved. Whatever that means, you admire it anyway. Nearby, an old woman waters a pot of thyme on her sill, carefully reaching between her shutters. She does it without opening them fully, just enough to pass her hand through. The shutters tilt at the precise, herbal slot, angle, 22 degrees. It's never been called that officially, but people know it. There's even a photo of it in the 1954 seasonal supplement, captioned only with Window 8B, Spring Rotation. You hear the water trickle, the leaves shake, and then she closes the shutter back with one hand, locking it with a sliding wood latch shaped like a spoon handle. Maybe the other half of the fork bracket. You wonder. A few houses later, you see a shutter painted bright crimson. It's unusual, too bold for the area, but it's balanced by a pale, almost ghost-white curtain inside. Together, they form what's known colloquially as a silent shout. It draws the eye, then calms it. This pairing appears once in the old 1950 training sketches used by inspectors in training. Exhibit G, do not adjust. Intention evident. That's the highest praise the manual ever offers. You pass another shutter that's closed, latched tight, but emits a faint creak every few seconds. The wind moves through it, not around it. It's not broken. It's breathing. That's what old wood does. It speaks. It resettles. It remembers the shape of past days and tries to relive them. There's no official description for this. But an early editor once scribbled in the margin of a draft, "Wood dreams." You like that? Your pace slows now, not because you're tired, but because the shutters are starting to feel less like objects and more like old acquaintances. Each one holds a posture, a voice, a choice someone made years ago and never quite unmade. You pass a faded teal shutter with rusted hinges, the color sun bleached into something soft and forgetful. It's ajar, just slightly, enough to let in a sliver of wind. Or suspicion. Inside, you catch the shadow of a linen curtain. Still and full, no movement at all. There's no indication of current occupation. Maybe the window hasn't been opened in months. Maybe it's the type of house that smells like dried lavender and forgotten mail. A procedural detail noted in the 1949 Supplement on Seasonal Inactivity says, "Windows intended for long dormancy should have shutters latched with secondary fastenings, preferably of hemp cord or iron twist, to prevent wind shift and animal nesting. This one doesn't. It creaks faintly in the breeze, the top hinge protesting every few seconds like it's quietly offended at being left behind. Just below the hinge, someone has scratched 3 parallel lines into the wood. Not carved, just scratched, rough and quick, possibly a child marking time, or a housekeeper noting something the manual never tracked. The charts don't allow for 3-line notations. That's not a system, that's a memory." On the next street, you find a shutter that makes you stop. It's not old, not elegant, just perfectly balanced. Both sides swing out at equal angles, held with identical black iron stays. The wood is plain, no carvings, no color, but the grain shines under a thin wax coat. It has the kind of symmetry that makes your shoulders relax. You'd call it manual perfect, if there was such a term. The closest reference you can find in your memory is a quote from the 1952 Alignment Guide, "When shutter halves open at mirror angle and sustain with no sway. Consider the adjustment exemplary. No notation required." It's funny, isn't it? Perfection doesn't need to be recorded, just felt. You keep walking and spot one that clearly broke the rules. It's been fitted upside down, slats running against the grain, hinges visible in all the wrong places. Whoever installed it either had no chart or simply didn't care. But it holds. It hasn't fallen, which means it passed the only test that truly matters, staying put. There's an obscure warning from the 1937 emergency update. Improper shutter inversion may result in whistling pains during gust conditions. The phrase sounds ridiculous, but you've heard it before. A soft high-pitched note that comes and goes with the wind. Like a tea kettle thinking about something. This shutter doesn't whistle, but it hums, a dull, wooden vibration when the wind catches it just so. It hums in G minor, or something close enough to lull. Up ahead, there's a building you've been meaning to see again. Its shutters are layered, double panels with internal slots for what was once called the accordion shade method. You remember reading about it in an old Dutch engineer's field log. The design allowed you to open just the bottom third of the shutter without disturbing the top. Great for privacy and late morning sunshine. No official diagram of this survived the 1960s updates. But the instructions did. Handwritten in a margin, slide pin left to release base plate. Do not force. Today, only one of the base plates still slides. The others are fixed in place, probably painted over too many times. But the remaining slot reveals a patch of sunlit floorboards inside. And on them, the edge of a woven rug. Faded from terracotta to soft blush. That kind of color shift takes decades. That kind of sunlight, intentional. You pass another shutter with a brass keyhole. Not a latch, not a clasp, a literal keyhole, right in the middle of the lower panel. It's from the lockdown years, as the manuals refer to them, when household security became shorthand for peace of mind. The procedure was straightforward: lock the shutter, not the window. Keys were distributed by neighborhood elders or, in more organized zones, the local carpenter's apprentice. Only one copy per house. Lose the key, and you didn't open your window for a week. Most of these were phased out by 1958. But this one lingers. There's no key visible, but the keyhole has been polished, recently. Someone still honors the ritual. And just beneath it, an old ceramic tag dangles from a tiny nail. You lean in. It reads, liedjes, Dutch for songs. You think of someone locking their window against the cold but still wanting to hear music from outside. The key was for the wind. The tag was for the ear. Further on, you stumble across a shutter that's been patched with tin. Not subtle. A broad sheet of gray metal covers half the surface, hammered on with soft nails and sealed at the edges with wax string. The shutter's original wood peeks out from the other half, streaked and split, but proudly still there. This is a survival shutter. Probably storm damage, maybe fire. The manuals refer to these fixes in a section called Composite Continuance. It advises where a shutter must be made whole by mixed material. Ensure no edges rise above wood line more than 1.5 millimeters. Waxing strongly advised. This one rises a little more than that, but it's still doing its job. It swings open with a tilt, creaks twice, and catches sunlight like it's earned it. And then you find one that hasn't aged well. The wood has warped, the hinge half pulled from the wall. A clump of moss grows where the bottom corner meets the sill. The latch is missing. The paint flakes like pastry. There's no dignity in decay, but there is honesty. And if you check the back of the 1951 troubleshooting manual, you'll find a line you never forgot: when a shutter fails, it does so where the house forgets to care. No diagrams, no solutions, just that sentence, a quiet acknowledgement. You don't stop long. Some things are better noticed than studied. The street curves gently now, like the spine of a sleeping cat, and you follow it with the ease of someone who has surrendered all sense of destination. Around you, the shutters remain at their quiet posts, watchful, cooperative, mildly judgmental. One, a deep indigo pear with narrow vertical slats, stands perfectly shut, its brass latch shaped like a lion's mouth. The ring is cold to the touch. You know this, because you've touched it before. Maybe last season, maybe in a dream. There's a procedural note in the 1950 version of Shutter Configurations for Urban Corners that details how lion latch shutters were mostly decorative, intended for civic buildings or homes of retired notaries. Symbolic fauna, it calls them, to denote a house of order. You like that idea? A lion, not to scare, but to say, paperwork lives here. The latch on this one sticks slightly when pulled down, a common fault that never made it into any maintenance diagram. Users were expected to feel it out, as the manual euphemistically phrases. No wonder notaries were such patient people. Above you, a shutter has come unhinged. Not all the way, just one screw loosened so the top corner dips forward like a shrug. It wobbles faintly with the wind, and you can't help but watch for longer than necessary. It's not falling, it's just reconsidering. There's an obscure 1944 wartime pamphlet that describes this exact posture: partial unfastening. Type C, allowable if window remains sealed, provided external interference is minimal. The phrase, external interference, is never explained, which is exactly why people still debate whether Type C was ever enforceable. The next shutter you see has a message etched on its inner panel. Not carved, just traced in pencil or perhaps wax. A looping series of letters you almost decipher before giving up. Could be a name, could be a note. The sun has done its part to obscure the ink, blurring lines into suggestion. You imagine someone scrawling it one morning after the rain, maybe just before they moved away. The procedural rules were silent on emotional annotations, but there was a quirk, briefly mentioned in a handwritten addendum from 1951. Messages left on inside panels must be cryptic enough to elude casual interpretation, which feels like a loophole custom made for longing. Further down, you find a shutter still painted in layers, blue over green over gray. The grain barely shows through, and there's something theatrical about it. Like a stage actor in too many costumes. You lean in and count the flecks, 13 visible brush strokes in one corner alone. The painter was thorough, or bored. The official sanding protocol, laid out in 1954, recommended no more than 2 coatings before grain is compromised. But most folks ignored that, especially when the grain had long since stopped caring. Beside it, a much simpler shutter, small, square, painted russet red, with a single hook latch that looks hand-forged. You're almost certain this one was part of the One Hammer project of 1946. when shutter repair kits were distributed across rural districts during the post-war rebuild. Each kit included one small hammer, 6 nails, and a folded instruction page that was waterproofed with beeswax. You've seen one of those hammers in a museum. It was barely the size of your hand. A quiet wind stirs the edges of another shutter. This one painted saffron and bearing a faded stenciled number, 11. It's not an address. You know that much. In fact, the numbered 10 system was an unofficial strategy used by some families to catalog the alignment quirks of multiple shutters in a single home. Number 11 tilts in rain. Number 3 whistles after dusk. There was no master ledger. Just anecdotes and shared knowledge. You remember a footnote in the 1952 procedural sidebook. Some households prefer shorthand. Respect it. You do. You always have. There's a moment now, a pause in your walk, where nothing moves. The shutters hold still. Even the birds are quiet. You can hear your own heartbeat echo faintly in the space between house and air. And then, from somewhere, the gentle click of a shutter closing. No rush. Just completion. You see it then, a rare 3-panel shutter mounted on a wide barn-style window. The central panel folds inward like a book cover. It's one of the accordion configurations, marked obsolete in 1957 due to warping risks. But this one has held its shape. A marvel of patient carpentry and dry summers. Its hinges are iron, blackened and slightly feathered with rust at the edges. A thin cord is tied from the bottom panel to the frame, a makeshift stabilizer never mentioned in any manual. But clearly the work of someone who cares. Likely passed down from whoever installed it decades ago. The original blueprint of that mechanism likely lived in someone's coat pocket. Or their memory. Or nowhere at all. A shutter 2 doors down is less fortunate. It sags like wet parchment. Its paint peeling in papery curls. You recognize the type. Pine. Untreated. A bad choice for moisture-heavy districts. The manuals tried to warn everyone. Page 113. Paragraph 2. Avoid softwoods unless fully varnished and oriented beneath eaves. The houses that listened still stand proud. This one, clearly, did not. But then, even flawed shutters have their place in the archive. They show you what not to do. What time does when you're not watching. And that has its own kind of wisdom. You brush your fingers along the edge of a shutter shaped like a paddle, broad and flat. Painted a color that may once have been teal but now reads like old sky. A latch shaped like a fishtail holds it shut. You smile. This must be one of the coastal imports. Designed for wind and salt and stubborn seagulls. Not typical for this inland village. But sometimes shutters travel farther than the people who mount them. The manual says nothing about fishtail latches. But you recall a sidebar from 1956 that mentions decorative analogues to maritime fixtures may provide unexpected longevity in dry climates. It's a sentence you've always liked. Sensible, yet faintly poetic. And now, as you round the bend, the houses fall into deeper shade. The shutters here are older, quieter, less expressive, the kind that have seen too many seasons to bother opening all the way. You walk slowly, gently, as if the whole village is holding its breath. And maybe, in this moment, it is. You come upon a courtyard now, half-shaded, half-forgotten. The shutters here speak with a different accent. Not literally, of course. But their design, narrow slats, tightly placed, mounted at sharper angles, tells you they came from the northern districts. Likely the result of one of those post-war contractor migrations, where itinerant builders brought their preferences along with their tool belts. You lean closer to one. It's painted in layers of gray and ochre. The edges still sharp despite the years. There's a split down the center. Barely visible unless the light hits it just right. That's the tell of a snap panel model, officially categorized in the 1955 Regional Guide as Type N4B. These were once prized for their fast repairs. Snap off the panel, replace the back slat, snap it on again. But the truth? Most of them were never snapped apart again. Too delicate, too precious. You run a finger along the bottom rail. A small chip, perfectly round, marks the center. It's not damage, it's a punch hole. A remnant from the original stencil template used during the alignment process. Most builders sanded these out. Some didn't. And now, 70 years later, you can trace the memory of the stencil with your thumb. There's a gentle creak behind you. And you turn slightly, not out of alarm. Just curiosity. A cat pushes open a partially latched shutter with its head. A simple russet wood frame, clearly unlatched for ventilation, sways inward under the feline's gentle insistence. The shutter swings back with a sigh, as if acknowledging the interruption. The cat disappears inside. No one calls after it. You smile. There's a diagram in the 1948 manual for pet-resistant shutters, narrower gaps, tighter latches. Nothing remotely fun for a cat. You've never seen one used. Nearby, a more decorative piece catches your eye. 2 shutters, deep forest green, are carved with concentric circles. Not painted, carved. The rings run like tree growth. And the center point is off-kilter, adding a touch of human imperfection. This is handwork, not factory issue, likely done during a winter lull. You recall a procedural clause from the 1951 Artisan Amendment. Modifications of aesthetic value are permitted if non-load-bearing and non-obscuring. In other words, decorate all you like, as long as the window still gets light. A few feet away, a shutter with copper hinges gleams dully in the shade. You can tell they were cleaned recently, not polished to shine, but rubbed just enough to keep the green at bay. That's a very particular ritual. Copper cleaners often did their work before dawn, out of habit or superstition. There's no record of when that started, but there's a note in the 1953 maintenance memo. If hinge polishing occurs before 7 a.m., consider replacing linseed oil monthly. The logic remains unclear. You reach the edge of the courtyard and find an oddity, a shutter with a wooden peg inserted through its latch hole. Not locked, not secure, just pegged, a makeshift placeholder. It reminds you of an old rumor about apprentice builders who weren't allowed to use metal hardware until they passed a silent test. Leave your shutter pegged for a full season without incident, and you'd earned your latch. There's no real proof of that tradition, but you've seen enough peg shutters to believe it anyway. At the far end, you notice a shutter that looks younger. Not newer, just less certain. The color hasn't faded yet, and the slats don't quite line up. You can tell it was installed by someone learning as they went. The screws are a little too proud. The brackets misaligned by a few degrees. But it stands firm, and the tilt is gentle. A beginner's shutter, yes, but a shutter with heart. The 1954 guide was generous to new craftsmen. Alignment improves with practice, it said. Pride precedes precision. You liked that phrasing so much you wrote it once, on a napkin, during a rainy afternoon lunch. You wonder if the napkin is still in your coat pocket, somewhere at home. There's a hum in the air now, the sound of bees skimming above rosemary bushes nearby. Their path takes them close to a shutter that's been stained a deep walnut color, unusual for this region, but common in the western hills. The scent of the wood, even after all these years, holds a faint warmth, a note of resin. The manual says nothing about scent, but it should've. This shutter has a small notch in the corner. Purpose unclear, not damage, not decorative, just a missing sliver. You crouch to look closer. It could be a grip point, could be a repair start mark, could be nothing. The open-endedness is what draws you in. Someone walks past behind you, softly, with a slight limp. You catch only a glimpse of their sandals. They stop beside a different shutter, one painted a faded teal, and check the latch with a fingertip. Not to open it, just to feel that it's there. Then they walk on. You stay quiet. The shutters stay quiet. Even the bees are considerate. And now, you find yourself facing a shutter that's more patch than panel. 4 different woods, 2 old repairs, a metal plate in the center shaped like a heart, clearly salvaged from something else. This shutter has had a life. Or many. The bottom rail bears a faint burn mark, likely from a time when someone set a candle too close in the dark. The shape resembles a comma. The manuals never mentioned candle proximity, but there's an anecdote in the 1949 interview appendix. A shutter may remember light more than shadow. You look around the courtyard again. Each panel, each hinge, each slat tells a different part of the same quiet story. The system isn't strict. It isn't tidy, but it works, through practice, and memory, and 1,000 tiny choices made in silence. This place doesn't need fanfare. Just shutters, and you. There's something grounding about standing still in a place that has no intention of hurrying. You rest your hand on a window ledge worn smooth by decades of weather. Just below a shutter painted in faded saffron. It's the kind of color that probably started bold, maybe even brave, but has softened over time into something gentle and familiar. Like a loud friend who's learned how to whisper. The slats of this shutter are uneven. And not in a careless way. You recognize the staggered pattern, an intentional design. Once noted in the 1947 Field Supplement as Modified Vent Type 3A. The purpose was airflow without full exposure, ideal for regions that needed circulation but feared sudden gusts. The official diagram included a curious addendum, works best during temperate mornings and unresolved arguments. Still not sure what the latter meant. You glance at the latch, a rusted iron hook shaped like a shepherd's crook. It doesn't quite close anymore. But then again, neither does the door beneath it. Everything here seems content in its imperfection. That's something the newer manuals stopped acknowledging. But the old ones? They made room for idiosyncrasies. Page 112 of the original binder from the Utrecht district reads, "Deviation may result in charm, provided function remains intact." That sentence has always stuck with you. A small creak above pulls your gaze up to a shutter that's been pinned open with a twig. Not a wedge, not a clip, just a literal, lightly curved twig jammed into the corner. It's still green, barely dried. You imagine someone plucking it from a nearby hedge this morning and pressing it into place without ceremony. Functional, natural, the kind of adjustment that would never make it into the procedural updates. Yet somehow deserves its own chapter. A breeze rustles past. The air smells like baking mortar and distant coffee. A woman leans out from one of the higher windows, just briefly, to adjust the angle of her shutters. She pulls them in slightly, then pushes one outward again until the shadow it casts splits evenly across the tiled floor inside. That's the old balance trick. In a 1950s workshop manual for domestic layout, it's described as shadow framing, where inhabitants would adjust shutters by light alone, seeking symmetry between sun and ceramic. There were even diagrams, little sun faces and angled lines. Completely unnecessary, but wonderfully poetic. Down below, near a low stone step, you spot a shutter missing one of its slats. Not broken, just removed. You can tell by the clean edges. Someone did it on purpose. In fact, in certain communal housing circles, that kind of alteration used to indicate availability, if you removed the fourth slat from the top. It was an invitation to borrow salt. Or sometimes just to chat. A social semaphore, encoded in wood. Of course, the practice faded with time. People started using notes instead. Or curtains. Or just closed the shutters completely. Still, you see one like this and wonder what it meant to someone. Once, you pass a shutter that looks ordinary at first glance, simple construction. Worn brass brackets. Deep red paint. But at the bottom edge, there's a small bundle of thread tied around the frame. It's dusty, but intact. 3 colors, blue, white, and green. This is where procedural meets personal. The 1952 shutter code for maintenance status used fabric flags tied discreetly, green for still good, blue for repainting soon, white for unstable hinge. But some pickers twisted them together. Like a bouquet of intentions. The manuals advised against mixing signals. But human nature, as always, shrugged and did it anyway. You run your fingers along a shutter marked by small, horizontal notches near each slat, 5 in total. This isn't decorative. This is the mark of a repair cycle. Back in the day, each notch was carved after a slat was replaced. Sort of like tally marks in reverse. If the wood could talk, it'd whisper, "I've seen things, and I'm still here." The quirk here? In one northern hamlet, they supposedly stopped at 5. The 6th repair meant the shutter had to be ceremonially removed, placed in the village center, and allowed to retire. The fate of the retirees? Mixed reports. Some became benches. One reportedly ended up as part of a chapel door. Most just leaned quietly against walls, proud and a little confused. Nearby, a young boy pauses beside a shutter shaped slightly differently than the rest, taller, thinner, with extra reinforcement on the side rails. He taps it lightly with his knuckles. It gives off a hollow, musical note, like a drum that forgot its rhythm. This is one of the few acoustic slats built for buildings close to public squares. The idea was to amplify sound subtly, so the interiors stayed attuned to the outside world. In practice, they mostly just let in pigeons and rain. You smile. They meant well. Up ahead, a shutter catches the light just right and gleams faintly gold. Not real gold, just a residue from an old varnish that had mica in it. This style was popular for about 3 seasons in the early 50s before everyone realized it attracted flies. The manual rescinded the finish in an unnumbered update titled, Corrections and Regrets. You linger near a shutter with a dented edge and a curious streak of pale blue running down its center. Paint drip? Maybe, but it looks more like a finger swipe. Long since set into the grain. Was someone checking if it was dry? Did a child draw a line? Just because? The manuals would say, any marking not part of original schematic constitutes deviation. You'd say, it constitutes memory. And that, you think, is the real manual, the one written slowly, slat, by everyone who ever reached out to close a shutter in the half-light of morning. The shutters up ahead are smaller now, more delicate, more tentative in their design. You pass one that barely covers half the window it guards. Like a soldier who arrived late to formation but insists on standing tall anyway. It's painted a soft teal that's bled into the grain over the years, forming gentle tide lines that speak of many wet mornings and hurried closings. You lift your hand, feeling the faint warmth still lingering from the midday sun. The paint is chipped in the corners. Not damage, just age. This one's probably a Type 2C, a class of miniature shutters developed for half-height windows often used in stairwells or pantry alcoves. The 1949 design specs note that the smaller dimensions were best suited to regulate both light and discretion. Which is a beautifully vague way of saying, don't let anyone see what's cooking. Or who's sneaking the last preserved plum. There's a small iron hook holding this shutter in place, twisted like a shepherd's crook and attached by a single bent nail. You notice that it's been looped twice. Unnecessarily. That's not standard, but it does hold better. The manuals called for a single, direct latch loop, but the fine print admitted double loops, while not encouraged, are known to resist flutter in areas with unruly breezes or stubborn cats. Someone nearby clears their throat. The sound muffled behind a screen of vines. A shutter creaks closed. Another opens slightly, like a shrug. You can feel the rhythm again now, that strange unspoken dance between dwellings and weather. Between protocol and preference. The kind of balance manuals try to pin down in diagrams, but can never quite capture. You pause beside a shutter that doesn't open like the others. Instead of swinging out, it tilts, angled forward by a pair of small hinges fastened to the middle rail. This is a tilt panel. Rare, but documented. The 1951 installation booklet calls it a solution for buildings with insufficient lateral clearance or excessive pigeons. Both real concerns, one more than the other. The hardware looks original, aged brass with curling leaf motifs. Probably salvaged from an older model. You step closer and notice a set of pencil marks along the lower hinge, 4 tiny arrows pointing in different directions. Adjustment marks? Maybe someone was planning a repair and then never got to it. Or maybe it's a code. The manual doesn't say. You spot a shutter painted entirely in a faded rose pink. Unusual for the region. Most shutters lean toward earth tones, ochre, rust, faded green, but this one? Bold, or at least it was. The paint is flaking, revealing layers beneath, cream. Then a dull brown, then the raw wood, like sedimentary rock. A personal timeline in reverse. Rose pink shutters weren't strictly forbidden in the early drafts of the Dutch building guidelines, but they were listed under discouraged hues. Supposedly, the color confused migrating birds. The footnote just reads, see the heron incident, 1948. No further details were given. You linger anyway. You like this one. A breeze pushes through the alley, stirring the corner of a shutter fastened with a bit of twine. Not rope. Twine. It's looped like a tourniquet, tied tightly over a missing latch. This is what the manuals politely call temporary fixes with unapproved materials. The real term, used in workshops and whispered over tea. was Grandpa Hinges. Grandpa Hinges meant anything improvised. String, coat hooks, even, in one glorious documented case, an entire fork. The official stance? Discouraged. The local stance? Functional is good enough. You think back to the one with the fork. The story goes that it was a traveler, waiting out the rain in someone's abandoned barn. Shutter wouldn't close. Fork went in the hinge hole. Rain stayed out. Manual be damned. Across from you, another shutter has a small square hole in it, deliberate and precisely cut. It's been covered with mesh now, but the hole itself was likely a feeder port. You remember reading about these in the late 1940s. Small shutter cutouts that allowed household pets to access outer ledges or pass messages between floors. The term used was vertical sharing aperture, which sounds grander than it was. Still, the idea was charming. It allowed for small birds to perch, cats to observe, and, according to one Dutch folklore article, spirits to exit politely during illness. Not something the manual acknowledges directly. But page 67 does note, do not obstruct established apertures without community discussion. A technical way of saying, ask the ghosts first. You kneel briefly to study the bottom edge of a shutter near a cracked brick wall. Here, a row of small notches lines the wood like a counting board, 5. Then a gap, then 2 more. It's not a manufacturing defect. It's hand-carved. You can tell by the hesitancy of the second mark. You've seen this before, lunch marks. When workers would tally meals eaten in a particular location. Not daily attendance, not schedules, just lunches, just presents. The quirk? The practice faded not because people forgot, but because no one could agree on whether to carve at breakfast or after the meal. The inconsistency rendered the tally suspect, but the sentiment remains. You stand again, brushing your hand along the shutter's edge. The wood hums slightly with warmth from the sun. It feels honest, softened by time, yes, but still holding its shape. Like something or someone who's weathered 100 small things and decided to stay anyway. There's a final shutter near the edge of the alleyway, barely hanging on. One hinge is twisted, the other is rusted through. But it's still standing, still part of the system. Someone, long ago, tried to stabilize it by wedging a spoon, yes. Another one, into the bottom slat. It's stuck there, polished smooth by years of wind. The manuals never explain how so many spoons ended up in shutters. But then again, maybe some things don't need explaining. You turn the corner now, and the alley opens up slightly, revealing a quiet courtyard framed by aging brickwork and shallow windows. The sun has shifted. Its light now spills across the cobblestones in a slanted wash, catching on every speck of dust and pooling gently against the shutters. Some of them gleam faintly, not because they are polished, but because time, mildew, and memory all reflect light a little differently. This is a quieter stretch. The shutters here don't brag. They don't creak for attention. These are the veterans of the courtyard, the long fixed, long watched, long forgotten. You move closer to one that hasn't been painted in decades. The wood is silvered, like old driftwood, and speckled with soft lichen. The iron latch, original and hand-forged, bears the unmistakable T9 stamp, part of the 1936 T-series issued briefly before the war. Here's the procedural detail that few remember. T9s were discontinued after a 6-month run due to their overly intricate coil tension, which, while visually elegant, tended to seize up in freezing weather. The manual from that year states, recommended only for maritime-facing facades or poetic installations. You pause, and repeat that last part aloud to yourself. Poetic installations, that's the kind of phrasing that gets smuggled in by someone who really cares. The latch doesn't move anymore, but you can see where someone's oiled it over the years, slow. Precise streaks of dark that leave their own history in place of motion. The kind of care given not because something still works, but because it still deserves it. You step past a shutter that has been carved with a long, spiraled groove, not a crack, a carving, intentional, following no pattern you can name. Maybe decorative, maybe functional. The 1952 Modifications and Anomalies supplement includes a paragraph on aesthetic striations that reads more like a polite shrug. These should be documented but not necessarily removed. Meaning is often local. The quirk, if you can call it that, is how many of these grooves have been found to mirror constellations, Orion, Cassiopeia, a messy version of the Pleiades. No one ever took credit. No one ever explained, but they show up, over and over, like messages left by skywatchers who couldn't reach the stars. So they etched them closer. You sit for a while beneath a low window with a shutter that never opens. You know it never opens because the hinge is sealed shut with lead paint, layered and bubbled like frost on pudding. Someone made a decision here. No access, no light, no one else seems to mind. The manuals are vague on such closures. The 1950 booklet merely notes, windows may be retired when the risk of temptation outweighs the benefit of view. Which is either metaphor or serious legalese. Hard to say. A cat slips past you, brushing its fur against your ankle before leaping lightly onto the sill above. It sniffs the edge of the shutter, then curls up beneath it like it knows something you don't. Maybe it does. There's a rustle to your left. Another shutter creaks softly, revealing a woman's hand, sliding out a small, woven pouch. She hangs it from a nail beneath the frame. This is a salt pouch, part of an old Dutch tradition where a pinch of salt would be hung on certain windows to season the day. Literally, symbolically, superstitiously, the custom fell out of favor by the early 60s. But some families kept it up. Just in case, they'd say. And here's the official line, in the 1955 footnote to the Household Shutter Maintenance Guide. There's one mention, just one, of mineral-bearing decorative sacks. The tone is dismissive. No maintenance required unless leakage causes corrosion. That's it. Salt, apparently, isn't the maintenance department's problem. You pass another shutter, this one bright blue and freshly painted. The brush strokes are still visible. You can smell the linseed oil. Someone's taken care here, not out of obligation, but pride. The screws, however, don't match. Two are brass, two are flathead, one is a paperclip bent twice and wedged into a stripped socket. That last part? That's pure ingenuity, and very much not covered by the manual. There's a term for it, surface loyalty. It's when the visible parts are maintained to spec. But behind the scenes, improvisation reigns, a known phenomenon, a tolerated sin. The 1957 addendum even calls it aesthetic compliance without structural rigor. You smile, because that's exactly what it is. You take a few more steps and find yourself before a shutter that's been reversed. Hinges on the outside, panels inside. It makes no functional sense. But it's perfectly symmetrical. Someone installed it backwards on purpose. Or by accident, or maybe because they liked how it framed the window when open. The manual never includes a diagram for this. But you know it's not alone. Once, in a sleepy village, you saw an entire row of reversed shutters, 12 in a row. All proud as peacocks and equally unbothered. One last note before you move on. There's a small leather strap hanging from a shutter hook nearby. Just a little tab. You tug it gently. It squeaks. Inside the window, you hear a bell ring once. Faintly, you blink. That wasn't expected. There's no mention of signaling devices in the standard shutter installation guide. None. But the 1943 Wartime Communication Manual does include a note about passive acoustic triggers. Used to signal inside when direct contact was discouraged. Forgotten after peace, but not, apparently, gone. And somehow, that seems fitting. The alley narrows again, like a breath held mid-sentence. The ground underfoot changes texture, from smooth cobblestone to a grainy grit that's softer. Quieter. Your sandals press faint outlines that the wind will erase in 10 minutes. Overhead, the sky has gone pearlescent. Not cloudy exactly, just dull in a way that makes the colors around you feel more saturated. A dusty red door, a patch of moss, and shutters, still everywhere, each with a story no manual ever quite finishes. You pass a shutter painted deep russet. The kind of earthy pigment that usually comes with a name like Bricksmith's Kiss or Harvest Flame. There's a smudge on the corner that hasn't been wiped away, maybe thumbprint. Maybe raindrop. The texture of the shutter is different too. Not wood, not quite. You tap it gently and hear the hollow ring of old tin. Thinned to the thickness of a coin. Procedural detail time. during the post-war shortage of 1947. Some rural towns issued guidelines approving the use of repurposed signage metal for shutter construction. The catch? You had to paint both sides. And you couldn't use red on the inside panel, something about confusing passing emergency patrols. The paint rule was lifted later. But the tin stayed, in quiet little spots like this. You look closely and find faint lettering beneath the russet, Cosmarkt von Dog, Cheese Market today. So, yes, definitely signage. The latch is also metal. And newer. It's riveted to the frame. With a twist lock that clicks faintly. You notice something odd. 3 dots scratched just beneath the latch in a perfect triangle. You touch them. They're shallow, but deliberate. A code, maybe, or just a quiet ritual. In 1951, a utility worker named Bram Jansen allegedly started marking shutters he'd serviced with 3 dots, always in the same spot. His son later claimed it was a superstition, 3 dots for lock. Look, leave, but no one confirmed it. It never made the manuals. You step away and hear something brush against your shoulder. It's a shutter, very slightly ajar, not enough to be open. But not fully closed either. The wind didn't move it. There's no draft here, which means it was like this already. Left like this, maybe on purpose. There's a phrase used in one of the training pamphlets, intentional imperfection. It refers to the practice of leaving one shutter in a row slightly misaligned. 2. Break monotony and maintain humanity. That's the phrase. You love that. Maintain humanity. As if precision were a threat. The next shutter you pass is large. 2 panels wide, reinforced with horizontal braces. A big boy, probably used to cover a wide farmhouse window. One corner has a rusted hinge plate with the initials, VDH. You remember this. Van Hook Ironworks. A short-lived manufacturer who made exactly 27 sets of these hinges before switching entirely to farm tools. You feel the weight of the panel with your hand. It's heavier than the others. Too heavy for casual maintenance. Which explains the pulley. Yes, just above it, worn rope through a corroded brass wheel. Threaded to a little cleat at the base. A pulley system. Here's a procedural curiosity. Rope-assisted shutters were briefly trendy between 1938 and 1940. Especially among tall-windowed farmhouses and anyone trying to impress a neighbor. But they fell out of use because they tangled. And sometimes fell. The 1941 bulletin makes this clear. Overhead pulley designs should be decommissioned unless operated by trained personnel. No one ever defined what trained personnel meant. As you turn another corner, your fingers skim past a shutter with chipped white paint. The wood beneath is nearly black. It gives under your touch. Just slightly. And you notice something unexpected. A music note carved into the lower edge. A quarter note. Simple. Elegant. No other marks. The 1955 supplement on ornamental detailing mentions musical carvings once. Maybe permitted provided no mechanical sound component is involved. That was probably aimed at the few experimental installations using wind-up music boxes built into the hinge casing. They were discouraged, of course. Too fiddly. Too much whimsy in a space meant for function. But this? Just a note. A reminder. Maybe. That music doesn't always need sound. Further on, you find a shutter painted teal and saffron, vertical stripes. Unevenly spaced. It stands out. Bold. You smile. There's nothing subtle here, and that's clearly the point. A child's handprint has been preserved in the bottom panel. Not painted, pressed into the damp wood long ago. Then sealed. You recognize the trick. A common family signature technique used from the 1930s through the late 50s. It didn't serve a purpose beyond identity. This is ours, it said. We touched this once. The quirk here? There was an unspoken rule among local painters. Never paint over a handprint if the shutter still swings. If it swings, it remembers. That was the phrase. It wasn't in any manual. Just passed down in quiet reminders. Over shared coffee and long brushes. You pause in front of a final shutter, small. Almost hidden in a narrow passage. The panel is cracked, but held together with strips of linen. Nailed down in a crisscross like bandages. You crouch to look closer. There, scrawled in pencil, are 3 words. Do not fix. No explanation. No signature. Just that. It makes you smile. You reach out. Then stop. You let it be. Some shutters are meant to stay broken. You move slowly now, like the shutters around you have adjusted your pace. Every creak of hinge or whisper of wind feels like a cue in a quiet symphony. You're not walking anymore, you're wandering. That's the correct speed for this kind of story. Ahead of you is something that doesn't quite fit, a shutter mounted at waist height. Lower than all the others. Covering what looks like, not a window. Exactly. More of a vent or perhaps a serving slot. The shutter is narrow, painted once in navy, but most of the color has flaked off in long, peeling curls that remind you of dried seaweed. The grain of the wood underneath is rough, cracked, and beautiful in the way forgotten things often are. You unthinkingly crouch to examine it more closely and notice a small tag nailed to the inside edge. Faded ink on canvas. 3 numbers, 629. Not a date, not a measurement, just numbers. You pause, flip through the mental index of everything you've seen tonight. You've heard of this, barely. It was part of a short-lived classification system in the late 1940s for low-access shutters, usually used in roadside inns and coastal cafes. Each number denoted something: opening frequency, height from ground, and visibility from the street. Why this one's still labeled? That's a question for someone else. A dog barks somewhere in the distance, not near enough to be startling, just close enough to be acknowledged. You stand again and press 2 fingers gently against the shutter. It doesn't move, not locked, just stuck in its ways. You pass a series of newer panels, well, relatively newer, painted in gentle ochre and green, with clean vertical planks and matching brass handles. All standard issue, all functional, all deeply, deeply boring. But even here, the details sneak in. A nail that doesn't match. A hinge set half a centimeter too high. A faint outline of something that used to be there, a sticker, perhaps, or a child's drawing long removed. And then, a shutter you recognize. You stop. It's familiar not because you've seen it before, but because everything about it feels intentional, centered, balanced. The panel is hand-carved. Its surface lightly sanded to preserve the tool marks. A single vertical slit near the top functions as a makeshift peephole, or a way to let the breeze in while still keeping the world out. Attached to the side is a small brass hook, with a loop of twine wrapped around it. Hanging from the twine, a faded feather. Procedural detail time. In some towns, mostly maritime ones, feathers were used as wind indicators on shutters. The direction the feather leaned told the occupant whether to open or close the window to prevent smoke from blowing inward. This method, noted briefly in the 1953 Seaside Variants Appendix, was favored by pipe smokers and bakers. But feathers fade, feathers fall. This one hasn't. You feel like if you knocked softly, someone might answer, but you don't. This place is a museum without signage, a church with no pews. Further along, you spot a panel with chalk scribbles. They look like someone's to-do list, a few Dutch words, mostly faded. One line says, Ramen open voor zon, which means, windows open for sun. Another reads, simply, milk. That's it, just milk. You smile again. There's an old manual, a real one, bound and printed in 1951, that insists shutters must never be used for non-shutter related documentation. The example given is lists, reminders, or grocery items, which, of course, meant every family did it. If it's not allowed, it becomes inevitable. And here it is, scribbled in chalk, defiant in its domesticity. Then, a strange find, a shutter within a shutter. Yes, really, it's a small cutout window, maybe 6 inches across, built into the upper quadrant of a larger shutter, hinged separately, with its own latch. You open the small one and find nothing. Just the backside of the closed main shutter. It's redundant, but also, somehow delightful. This was known, if rarely used, as a test slit. Designed originally for weather checks, you open the mini shutter to see if it's worth opening the big one. The manual from 1948 called it a prudent compromise between caution and optimism. Of course, they only printed that version once. No one really used the test slits. Too fussy, too finicky, too thoughtful. And that's the thing. So many of these features weren't necessary. But they were still included. That's what you're seeing now, not utility. But insistence. Someone, somewhere, cared enough to make something slightly better. Even if no one noticed. You keep walking. The alley begins to curve, hugging the shape of a canal just out of sight. A light fog is settling now. Nothing heavy, just enough to blur the corners of the world. The shutters are beginning to close around you like eyelids. Quiet, unmoving, watching. Then, a final quirk. You stop before a shutter that's been hand-painted in blue stars, dozens of them. Uneven and charming, trailing in a spiral from top to bottom. You'd seen something like this before. Months ago, on a crate in a different town. You didn't think much of it then. Now, though, you remember the story. In 1956, during the annual Spring Maintenance Challenge in Zierikzee, a retired sailor named Willem G. decorated his shutters this way as part of a celestial alignment project no one quite understood. His neighbors were furious. The council made him sand them off. But a few admirers, quietly, began painting their own stars. Just small ones, just on the inside panels. This one? This is full spiral. This is unapologetic. The rule book never caught up. You pause, then touch one star with your fingertip. Just lightly, and you keep moving. The alley narrows until it no longer feels like a passage at all. More like the architectural equivalent of a held breath. The shutters here are close enough to touch both sides at once. Which you do, palms flat, as if the houses themselves need reassurance that someone remembers. These panels are older than most. Older than you'd guess even by the wood grain. Some seem to predate uniform sizing entirely. The left side boasts 3 narrow boards fastened with what appear to be raw iron spikes. Not screws or nails. On the right, a single slab of oak. Dark with age, reinforced by a crossbeam. You note how these no longer follow the formal diagrams. They've drifted beyond the charts, beyond the manuals, and yet, still they function. Still they hold space. A faint aroma hovers here, linseed oil. Perhaps. Or old rope. Something maritime. Fitting, considering your next discovery. A shutter unlike the others. It's curved. Not dramatically so, just enough that it suggests it once belonged to a boat. Or something boat-adjacent. It arcs inward toward the wall. Held in place with rope loops instead of hinges. The paint is worn navy. And at its base, someone has carved a tiny symbol, a fish surrounded by dots. You recognize it instantly. It's the mark of the short-lived Dutch Coastal Shutter Initiative of 1944. A wartime program designed to repurpose naval materials for domestic protection during bombing raids. Procedural detail? These boat shutters were documented in a tiny appendix labeled Emergency Fabrications. According to protocol, any such panel had to include the fish sigil and be affixed with removable fasteners in case it needed to be reclaimed. Most weren't. This one, clearly, found peace as a window guardian. You reach out and give the rope loop a tiny tug. Nothing moves. And honestly, it shouldn't. Past that, a shutter with a completely different character greets you. This one is brightly painted, recently. Even, a rich indigo background, with stenciled white tulips running along the edges. You smile, not because it's particularly beautiful, but because it's trying so hard. Trying to bring a little brightness to a tired frame. On the lower edge, a piece of tape is affixed, yellowing and frayed. But legible. 3 handwritten words. Niet voor de kat. Not for the cat. The implication is clear. Someone has had to specify, perhaps more than once, that this window is not to be opened for feline traffic. It's delightful. It's ridiculous. It's probably ignored. The official shutter documentation from 1955 says nothing, absolutely nothing, about cats. It does, however, warn against wildlife interference. A phrase that makes you picture raccoons wearing tool belts. But no mention of domestic animals. Which means, naturally, people had to invent their own cat rules. You glance at the edge of the tape again and notice a tiny paw print in dust. The cat, it seems, disagrees. Around the next corner is a shutter that doesn't open at all. Or rather, it pretends not to. The hinges are ornamental, forged in the shape of curled vines. The latch is sealed shut with wax. The panel is painted to resemble wooden slats. But on closer inspection, it's all an illusion. This is stonework. plastered and shaped to look like a shutter. A false shutter. These were common in the early 1900s during aesthetic housing movements. If a window didn't require shade or privacy, but symmetry demanded balance, a false shutter was installed to complete the facade. The manuals of the time refer to them as visual harmonics. You don't know what that means either. But they're lovely. In a way, honest lies. There's a note, though, an oddity. At the base of this one is a tiny keyhole. No door, no knob, just the suggestion of access. You crouch, peer closer. The keyhole has been filled in with putty, then painted over. No key could ever turn here. But someone, once, wanted you to believe it could. You walk a bit farther and find a cluster of shutters that form a pattern when seen together. 3 windows across, 3 shutters per window, each panel painted in a slightly different shade: teal, olive, slate, fern, jade, smoke, pine, and finally, crimson. The last one startles you. It's not garish, just unexpected. Crimson like sealing wax, like a pressed petal. The paint is thick, and it's been reapplied many times. Layers upon layers, probably covering something up. A name? A message? A mistake? You resist the urge to scratch at it. There's a story whispered in some shutter painter circles, yes. That's a thing, about a single crimson panel in Rotterdam that hit a love note so scandalous the building owner demanded it be painted over. Then repainted every year for 4 decades to ensure it stayed buried. Was this the one? Probably not. But maybe. You exhale slowly, eyes softening. The fog is lifting just slightly. The air is drier now. The shutters creak more easily. Somewhere nearby, a bird calls. It's the first you've heard all night. And now, in a small courtyard, barely 10 feet wide, you find the final surprise. A rotating shutter. Yes, rotating. This contraption was part of a 1930s experiment in urban ventilation. Rather than opening outward or inward, the panel was mounted on a central spindle, allowing it to spin like a vertical weather vane. The goal was to disrupt urban heat clusters and promote airflow. It did not catch on. The manual from 1932 describes it as mechanically elegant, socially divisive, which is hilarious. But standing here now, with your hand resting on the edge of the rotating shutter, you can't help but admire it. Half function, half folly, the best kind of design. You give it a gentle spin. It turns with a whisper, then halts slightly off-center. Perfect. A breeze moves through the alley just as the rotating shutter clicks back into place, a subtle sound. Barely audible, like a page turning in a book that's too old to read out loud. You leave it behind, because everything here asks gently to be left exactly where it is. Now, the ground changes. You feel it first in the way your steps respond. Stone gives way to gravel. Then to something else. Packed earth. Softer, but not quite yielding. A courtyard, maybe, or an old garden path that's forgotten its purpose. Here, the shutters rise high again. This time 2 stories or more. These are the grand ones. The statements. Homes with pretensions, or memories of pretensions. Painted cornices. Glass panes divided into quarters. And the shutters, each with hinges so large they look like they've been repurposed from ship doors. You pause at one such shutter. The latch is leather, not original. Not recent, just well-meant. It's held in place with brass tacks and optimism. Above it, a series of small punched holes run along the edge in an arc. A pattern? A vent? A design choice? According to one late-stage manual revision from 1961, some households experimented with perforated shutters to allow airflow without full exposure. The suggestion came from an Austrian consultant. It lasted precisely 1 spring before Dutch families universally rejected it, citing whistling, leakage, and too many bees. Still, the holes remain, and you find yourself pressing your fingers into them, like Braille for a different sense. Across the way, you see an asymmetrical shutter. One side hangs slightly higher than the other, but not by accident. The slant is deliberate, a single hinge at the top, and 2 offset latches on the bottom, designed to hold the panel at a tilt when opened. Why? A procedural oddity buried deep in the archive explains, in coastal towns with uneven sun exposure, tilted shutters were used to redirect light onto indoor plants. They called them sun scoops. The tilt could be adjusted with a secondary peg. Long since gone, but the angled latches still tell the story. You like that one. You imagine a little pot of thyme just inside the window, soaking up the redirected warmth. The wind picks up slightly, brushing through ivy that's climbed the base of the next building. And here you find a contradiction. A shutter with no window. It's not boarded shut. It's just a shutter. Mounted to the wall. Painted a soft ochre. Hinges polished. No glass. No opening. No reason. Somebody, somewhere, decided to install a shutter for a window that does not exist. There is no procedure for this. No manual. No note. It simply is. Maybe the window was planned and never cut. Maybe it was filled in after a renovation. Or maybe someone just liked the idea of symmetry more than functionality. You can't know, but it's one of your favorite things so far. You press your palm gently to the wood. It's warm, slightly curved, holding its shape against time. From there, you follow the alley as it widens again, feeding into a quiet square. And now, the shutters grow sparse. Fewer buildings, more sky. You sit. A stone bench curves around the base of a linden tree, and you take it without hesitation. The shutters here are mostly closed, folded in tight for the night. Only a few remain open, holding space for dreams or late-night breezes. There's one across from you that draws your attention. Not because it's beautiful, it's not. It's chipped and a little warped, with a single loose hinge at the bottom left. But it's been painted with words. Not in graffiti, not in haste. In elegant script, now faded. Als de wind niet white. Roe dan. If the wind doesn't blow. Row. You smile. The sentiment fits. This one likely came from the inspirational edges trend of 1959. When a local lifestyle magazine suggested stenciling affirmations on shutters for motivation. The fad lasted a year. The paint, clearly, lasted longer. There's no procedural basis for it. Just a human one, and that's enough. Your eyes trace the pattern of the square now. The houses here are quiet. No lights on, no voices, the kind of silence that feels earned. You close your eyes. Then, gently, a sound. Cloth rustling, a latch clicking, a window opening. You glance up. A second-story shutter swings wide, just enough to allow the night in. A candle glows behind the glass, flickering slightly. Someone's still awake. And in that moment, you remember an obscure note from one of the early manuals, tucked between latch types and grain recommendations. A line about how shutters, when opened slowly after sunset, could be used to signal a message to nearby homes. Nothing official, no codebook, just the implication. I'm home. I'm safe. I'm still here. And now the candle goes out. Just the moon, just the air, just the sound of shutters settling back into sleep. You stand, stretch, let your shoulders fall. The last thing you see before turning away is a very old shutter. Warped, missing a hinge, faded green. It doesn't open anymore, doesn't close either. But it's still here, and somehow, that's enough. You turn the final corner, where the alley returns to gravel and the shutters begin to thin into absence. Fewer windows now, fewer homes. The city gives way to quiet. And the quiet gives way to fields. One last shutter greets you on the outer edge, a small one. Barely the width of your hand. Set into stone, high above your head, likely from a storage loft. Its color is pale lavender, faded by rain and years of indifferent sun. You look up at it, and it looks down at you, like two old friends arriving at the same thought at the same time. The latch is a twist type, simple, elegant, worn smooth from generations of fingers. The 1948 diagram labeled it as Class 4C, Rural Twist Latch. Child operable, no locking feature. The note beside it reads, acceptable for hay storage. Non-essential ingress. You love that phrase. Non-essential ingress. Like a shrug, but written by a bureaucracy. You could end your walk here. But you don't. You follow a small path along a hedgerow, dry and rustling with late summer leaves. The smell of dill from someone's forgotten patch carries on the wind. You walk slowly, now without any urgency, the pace of someone who has already arrived, and is simply finishing the sentence. Up ahead, half buried in moss, is something strange, a wooden panel. Too small to be a door. too large to be a trap. Its hinges are ornamental, filigreed in wrought iron, with a swirl pattern that was popular in the 1930s. It's a shutter, yes, but horizontal. Horizontal shutters were experimental, a brief flirtation with architectural romance. For cellars, for root storage, for secret windows, they never took off. Too damp, too tempting for bored cats. But a few still survive. Like this one. You crouch beside it. There's no latch, just a small ring handle and a rusted washer. It hasn't been opened in a decade. Maybe more, but you can still imagine what was once beneath it. Jars. Carefully lined, bottles wrapped in twine, a cold place for things worth saving. That's what shutters are, you realize. Not just protection, not just ornament, but memory, hung on hinges. You keep going, letting the hedgerow end behind you. There's a fence now, waist high and leaning with time. Beyond it, a field. Not cultivated, not managed, just a loose weave of grass and buttercups. And in the middle of it, impossibly, improbably, a shutter. Freestanding, like a sculpture. No wall, no house, just 4 iron stakes holding it upright. You blink. It's real. Painted navy, reinforced corners, a brass hook on one side. Broken. No explanation, no context. The closest reference you remember is a 1957 footnote about memorial shutters, a very small initiative to preserve the materials of homes that were demolished due to urban planning shifts. Some were displayed in museums, others in parks. A few, it seems, made it to fields like this. To stand alone and remember things no one else could. You approach it, slowly. There's a plaque, tarnished but legible. This shutter belonged to the home of Neeltje H., 1912 to 1953. It opened onto a rose bush. That's all. You don't need more. The air is cool here. Different than in the alleys. Less architecture, more sky, and somewhere beyond the trees, you hear it, the soft, unmistakable creak of a shutter swinging shut. Not near, not urgent, just one more voice in the quiet night, reminding you that the system still works. Even when no one's watching. You take one last breath. It smells like pine and iron and varnish and time. And then you walk slowly toward the edge of the frame. The shutters don't need you now. They never did. Let it all fade now. Let the field dissolve into soft color. The navy shutter receding like a story already told. Let the grass hush beneath your steps. And the sky lower its volume, dimming in gentle folds above the horizon. You're not walking anymore, not exactly. Just gliding, slightly, inside the memory of movement. Your breath softens, your body, weightless. The hinges no longer creak. The latches no longer click. All of it, every bracket, every chipped edge, every lavender-painted square, is where it should be. You've been walking not through a city, but through a quiet pocket of someone's care. A neighborhood of gestures, of doors opened halfway and closed carefully. Of tiny signals and rituals no one taught you, but which you understood anyway. Now the light shifts. It bends gold and low, even if you can't quite see the sun anymore. The shutters are all closed now. Or maybe they've disappeared. That's all right. They'll return. These things always do. Your hands are at your sides. Your eyes are closed now. Or they're thinking about it. The breeze is barely a suggestion. The world tilts just enough to remind you of rest. And in this stillness, with the last of the night settling gently across the fields, there is only one instruction left. Sleep. The shutters are drawn. The day is done. The system holds. And you are home. Hey guys, tonight we're headed to the Suva Municipal Market, tucked near the harbor in Fiji capital city, sometime before the sun has even considered waking up. You're here early enough that the sky still wears its nighttime blues. Not quite ready to shift into daylight. The air smells like damp canvas, river silt, and the faint metallic tang of corrugated tin roofs cooling off from yesterday's heat. You can hear the harbor sloshing in the distance. Soft waves tapping wood pilings like someone too polite to knock. The market is quiet, not silent. Markets are never truly silent, but it's a sleepy kind of buzz. A banana crate creaks. A rooster one street over debates crowing but ultimately decides to hit snooze. A few tired lights flicker on, powered by whatever ancient wiring still hums through the market's bones. And then you hear it, the gentle scrape of stone against concrete. You turn a corner and see it happening. The day's first vendor. She's wearing a wide-brimmed hat, loose cotton pants, and a shirt that's seen 100 markets before this one. Her stall is nothing more than a simple canvas tarp stretched across a wooden frame. And to anchor the tarp? 3 stones. Always 3. They're not just any stones. These aren't random rocks scooped up from a ditch or borrowed from a neighbor's pile. These stones are smoothed by time, marked by fingertips, edges rubbed dull by daily handling. One is slightly flattened, another is speckled like quail eggshells, and the third has a tiny notch carved into one side. You wonder if it's intentional. Maybe a family mark, or maybe it just cracked during a long-forgotten drop. She sets them down with care, one at the front left corner, one at the right, and one behind, forming a kind of tripod that anchors the ropes of her canopy like a ceremonial triangle. You can almost hear her thinking, left for wind, right for balance, back for luck. You might be tempted to ask why not 4 or 2, but that would reveal your outsider status. Here, it's always 3 stones per stall. It's not written anywhere, but everyone knows it. She pulls her tarp taut and ties one end to a rusting hook in the concrete. Then she leans back, checking the angle like a sailor reading a sail. The canvas gives a soft flap. But it holds. That's the test. A procedural detail worth noting. Shade anchors in this market must be positioned within a 1.2-meter radius from the corner post. According to an old zoning schematic tucked behind the office desk. Mostly ignored but occasionally cited when someone overreaches. The chart doesn't mention stones. Of course, it says, anchoring apparatus. But no one brings sandbags. They bring stones. Another vendor arrives. This one pushing a cart piled with folded tarps and morning greens. He gives the first vendor a nod, not too big, not too small, and begins his setup. He, too, carries his 3 stones in a cloth sack. You can hear them clunk gently against each other as he walks. His stones are darker, heavier looking. One has a chipped corner. One is striped. One has a smear of faded red paint. Like someone tried to label it years ago but got interrupted halfway. You notice something else now, the rhythm of the work. Not rushed, not sloppy, just practiced. The way a baker rolls dough without thinking. Or a musician tuning strings between songs. The stones aren't placed, they're set. As if they remember their positions and the vendors are just returning them home. There's a breeze now, the faintest one, but you see how the tarp lifts just slightly. It tries to move. The stones hold. You walk between rows of half-set stalls, watching more vendors arrive, each with their own 3 stones. Some carry them loose in their arms, others in repurposed rice sacks. One man cradles his like small pets, pausing to wipe dust off one before placing it down. A quirk. One stall near the back uses unusually rounded stones. Almost like river pebbles. Local gossip says they were collected from the base of a waterfall 2 hours away. Because waterfall stones never lie. No one's sure what that means. But no one argues, either. And there, not too far from you, a young girl, maybe 10, helps her grandmother position the final stone. The tarp tugs. The girl adjusts. Then both of them nod. Satisfied. You wonder if this is her first time. Or her 50th. The sun still hasn't fully risen. But the light's changing. It's that thin, sleepy gray that promises warmth eventually. Vendors start laying out their goods, bananas, cassava, taro, bundles of leafy greens tied with twine. But none of it happens until the shade is anchored. The stones come first. Always. An unresolved note. No one seems to know why 3. Some say it's for balance, triangles being inherently stable. Others say it's tradition, nothing more. But there's also the story of the 1949 storm, when a vendor's 4-stone stall collapsed in the wind while the 3-stone ones held firm. Coincidence? Maybe, but try telling that to anyone here. You pause. Breathe in the morning, damp earth. Distant fire smoke. The faint sweetness of overripe mango. The market is waking, but for now, there's still a moment of stillness. Shade overhead, stones below, everything in its place. Now that you know what to look for, you start to see it everywhere. 3 stones, again and again, positioned at the feet of tarps. leaning against wooden poles, or wedged under table legs just so. You move slowly through the waking market like a ghost with no errands. No money, no need for breakfast, just a quiet appreciation for geometry and repetition. The vendors don't speak much at this hour. There's a language to the way they move instead. A woman tugs her rope with one sharp pull and immediately glances at her cornerstone, as if confirming a held breath. A man squats to adjust the knot at his central tie-down, then nudges one stone an inch to the left with his toe. No measuring tape, just instinct. The tarps themselves are all shades of faded, turmeric yellow, ocean green, dusty rust. Some have been patched with scrap cloth. Others still bear the original manufacturer stamp, now so sun-washed it looks like a birthmark. The stones, though, carry their own wear, grooves, chips, faint thumb-polished edges like worry stones on an industrial scale. There's a stall ahead of you that catches your eye, not because of the produce, though the pineapples are shockingly symmetrical, but because of the vendor's setup. Her 3 stones are flat, square-ish, and etched, lightly, not decorative, more like tally marks. 5 lines on one, 7 on another, 13 on the last. A pattern? Maybe. A record? Possibly. She doesn't look like someone who'd explain if asked. Procedural detail. Local ordinances allow vendors to begin setup at 4:30 a.m. but prohibit permanent anchoring devices. That means no bolts in the concrete, no hooks driven into city structures. Everything must be mobile, removable in 10 minutes or less, in the event of emergency. Stones? Technically temporary, always legal. And then there's the stacking. You see one vendor arrive late, just now unlocking his stall's storage crate. He lifts the lid and, instead of pulling out fruits or tarps first, he lifts out 3 stones stacked neatly, one on top of the other like pancakes. He takes a moment to roll his shoulders, then places them down one by one, front left, front right, rear center. You could trace the triangle from above. He doesn't check a manual, doesn't use a diagram, but you imagine if there were a booklet, it might read something like, place anchor stones in isosceles formation, 2 forward, 1 aft. Stones should be similar in mass but not necessarily identical in shape. Surface scuffs acceptable, gloss undesirable. A quirk, some vendors wrap their stones at night in cloth to keep the cool in. No one really explains what that means. It's not like the stones get hot in the morning, but maybe it's about routine, or care, or some small belief that a familiar stone is a dependable one. You stop near a young couple setting up a modest stand of coconuts and lemongrass bundles. The man finishes tying off the front of the tarp, then nods to the woman, who carefully places the final stone and taps it once, twice, with her fingertips, like she's sealing a letter. You lean against a pole and listen. There's music now, faint, but spreading. A tinny transistor radio somewhere plays an old island ballad, half static, half melody. The lyrics don't reach you, but the rhythm does. It fits. Around you, the market fills in like watercolor. Stalls bloom, voices rise, though still low and calm. Someone cracks open a cold coconut with a small blade, thunk. Thunk, split. The scent of pandan floats past. Near the entrance, a boy, maybe 7, drags 3 stones in a wooden crate too big for him. He's helping his grandfather, who grunts approvingly but doesn't assist. This is the boy's job. His triangle, his setup. You crouch beside a stack of root vegetables, watching another stall adjust for the morning wind. The vendor ties a rope from one tarp corner to a concrete planter, then uses 2 stones on the opposite side to balance the tension. You'd think 3 is a rule, but actually, it's a rhythm. When you watch them set up, it's always stone, tie, adjust, stone, tie, check, stone, nod, done. It's not just functional, it's choreographed. One factual detail most visitors miss: each vendor signs an informal setup roster, maintained in a single red ledger kept behind the western gate. You're never asked to sign it, it's just known. Vendors initial beside their stall number and time of arrival. And beside each name, a column. Anchor used, Y-N. No one ever marks, N. And there, under a blue tarp trimmed with red stitching, an older woman adjusts her 3rd stone with a sigh. You hear it, long, From somewhere deep, she wipes her forehead, checks the tarp's corners, and walks to her table. Someone once tried to replace the stones with a modern anchoring system, plastic clamps and sand-filled bags. It didn't last a week. A vendor laughs about it now and calls them city stones. The market didn't accept them. Neither did the people. There's a theory, you hear it whispered in corners, that the number 3 is lucky here because of the triangle's ancient symbolism. A stable base, a known center. And maybe that's true, or maybe it's just the number that works best. After all, try balancing a canopy with 2 stones on a windy afternoon. You'll be chasing shade all day. As you keep walking, someone hands you a banana. No charge, just a gesture. You thank them softly and keep walking through a now mostly set market. The tarp's fully drawn, ropes tight, stones steady. The market is awake now. But your pace is slower, lighter. You're not shopping. You're learning the rhythm, the quiet logic behind the system. 3 stones, always 3. By now, you've started recognizing the personalities behind the stalls, not just the people, but the arrangements. Each 3-stone setup is a little fingerprint, a personal dialect of anchoring. Some are precise, their stones aligned like compass points. Others are casual, almost tossed, except they never move. Not once. You walk past a spice vendor whose shade tarp is tied with thick, multicolored cords. Her stones are oddly round, almost polished, like river rocks instead of jagged coral or pavement chunks. 2 rest on a folded jute mat, and the 3rd sits in a shallow metal basin filled with sand. Decorative? Possibly. Functional? Definitely. She doesn't look up as you pass, but she does adjust the rear stone with her toe. Then lets her ankle hover above it for a moment. Maybe she's feeling for balance. Maybe it's just a habit. Like tapping the top of a soda can. Ritual, not science. You pause nearby and take note of the sounds. Each stall makes its own song, ropes creaking, fabric snapping, stone scraping concrete. A wood cart rolls by, rattling over uneven flagstones, leaving behind the sharp scent of ginger. The sun's higher now, and the shadows of the tarps stretch into long, cool triangles. The geometry of the market is becoming clearer. This isn't a random scattering of color and sound. It's a layered diagram, shade shapes, footpaths, wind flow, and at the base of it all, 3 stones. Procedural detail. There's an unspoken rule in most Fijian municipal markets, especially in the older ones, that vendors may not borrow another's stones without explicit permission. A borrowed stone without acknowledgement is considered not just rude, but unlucky. The reasoning? Anchors hold more than just fabric, they hold memory, energy, the footprint of whoever placed them. A woman in indigo places her 3rd stone with both hands, then steps back and bows slightly, not to anyone, just to the tarp. You don't interrupt. Nearby, a man grumbles about the breeze and unspools a thicker rope than most. He double wraps his pole, knots it twice, then adds his 3 stones in a triangular brace at the base. You watch as he picks up a 4th stone, examines it, then sets it aside on a cloth. He won't use it. 3 is enough. More would be overthinking. A quirk worth noting, in some stalls, the stones are marked, not with symbols, but with smells. You kneel beside a flower vendor and notice the faint scent of coconut oil on one. Another smells like lemongrass. A 3rd is dry, neutral, chalky. She catches your eye and just nods. No explanation given, or needed. You move through the aisles slowly now, more part of the flow than an observer. At a fish stall, the vendor uses dark basalt stones, wet, heavy, and salt-licked. He positions them with a precision that feels military, right angle. Firm press, half step back. He doesn't smile, but he hums under his breath as he works. It sounds like a war chant, but soft. Something passed down. You listen. An elderly man selling beetle leaves tucks his 3rd stone behind a stool leg. Then sits on it, just for a moment, like he's recharging. His tarp shifts slightly, catches the light, then settles. Balance achieved. You glance across the square and see a different kind of setup entirely, 3 stones in a triangle. Yes, but the tarp above is tattered. Its corners reinforced with woven pandanus strips. There's a small hand-painted board nailed to one post, no rain. No worry, but you can tell the stones are serious. This vendor has anchored through storms. You duck under a low tarp and spot something odd. One of the anchoring stones has a tiny hole drilled through the middle. And a loop of red thread runs through it, tied in a tiny bow. Why? No one knows. The vendor shrugs when you gesture. My grandmother did it, that's all. You don't ask again. You pause for a drink, sugarcane juice. Pressed fresh, slightly warm from the sun, but still refreshing. The vendor smiles and points to her anchoring triangle, 3 pink stones. Not painted, naturally pink. She doesn't explain, just says, lucky. You believe her. Unresolved note. Some stalls feature 1 stone placed just outside the triangle. Always in the same spot, southwest corner. Just beyond reach. No one steps on it. No one touches it. It's not mentioned, but it's there. You'll see it again, you're sure. The sun's brighter now, and the shadows have shortened. Vendors start to settle in, some sit cross-legged on woven mats. Others perch on low stools. The market's energy shifts from setup to presence. Selling hasn't quite begun, but the day has officially started. Anchors are in place. The stage is set. You stand at the heart of it all and look around. There are no manuals here. No laminated guides, but the system is real. And it runs deep. You feel it in the way each stall breathes, a ripple of movement kept in place by triangles of stone. And as you watch, another vendor lifts her last stone, spins it once in her palm like a coin, and sets it down with a smile. The sun isn't high enough to be hot yet, but it's beginning to test its angles. You feel the light tickle the back of your neck as you pass through a narrow row of stalls selling bread, papaya, and plastic sandals, the latter clearly not handmade. But no one minds. It's the kind of market where everything earns its place, whether made from scratch or shipped in stacked crates. You find yourself watching not the goods but the poles. Each stall has its own support system, bamboo, metal, even salvaged wood, and each one carries its own weight just slightly differently. The anchors, those 3 faithful stones, adjust accordingly. A larger pole? The stones are tighter in. A flimsy stake? The triangle widens, gives breath. At a vegetable stall, you see a girl no older than 10 press a corner stone back into place using her heel. She's not guessing, she's seen it done. It's muscle memory now. The tarp tugs taut again, casting clean shade across a pyramid of aubergines. She brushes her hands together and skips off, leaving no comment behind, just that silent act of balance. One factual procedural detail, in several Fijian municipalities, vendors are expected to recheck stone positions after midday breezes begin. Though unofficial, this habit is commonly referred to as the second anchoring. It's usually done without fanfare, just a nudge, a press, a toe check, but you'll see it happen almost in sync. Like birds adjusting mid-flight. You round a corner and find a man tying a hibiscus flower to one of his tarp's ropes. His stall smells like burnt sugar and roasted taro. You watch as he squints at his stone triangle, then reaches into his pocket and pulls out something strange, a wooden block with numbers carved into it. He places it flat on the middle stone, studies the shadows, then nods. Not a clock, not a compass, but clearly a guide of some sort. Some say vendors like him pass down these wooden tools like heirlooms. Others say they carve them new each season, updating angles based on sun memory and intuition. There's no registry, no list, just the soft calibration of 100 dawns. A quirky tradition emerges here, in this part of the market. Some stalls tie a bit of cloth, always triangular, around the center stone. It flutters in the breeze like a tiny sail. One vendor tells you, it shows wind loyalty. You're not sure what that means, but it sounds beautiful, and no one argues. As the wind shifts, you notice one shade tarp ripple more than the others. A vendor catches it mid-snap and presses a stone down harder, murmuring something under her breath, maybe a word, maybe just a breath shaped like one. Her stall sells ginger roots stacked in fans, like spiral suns. Across from her, an old man is retuning his stones. You recognize him, the same one who refused a 4th stone earlier. Now, he moves his triangle an inch westward, dragging the corner stone with the curved toe of a sandal. He hums a bit, then pulls out a folded piece of cloth from his bag. Inside it, a smooth flat pebble with a hole in the middle, one of the rare eye stones. Usually used only in weddings or blessings. He doesn't use it, just lays it on the cloth beside him. Like company. You crouch beside a pole and trace the ring in the dust where a stone sat minutes ago. It's like a ghost print. The memory of weight. The stall beside it hasn't opened yet. But someone prepared it. 3 impressions in the earth. Triangle still visible, as if saying, I'll be back. Unresolved note. Many market elders say the triangle's orientation matters more than the stones themselves. North facing? Wider base. East facing? Tip toward sunrise. But there's no universal diagram. No one teaches it formally. It's whispered, shown, mimicked. You rise and turn to a stall draped in teal and saffron cloth, colors vivid even in the filtered light. The vendor's stones are wrapped in palm fronds, woven tightly, with small charms tied to the bundles. One looks like a fishhook, another like a tiny bell without a clapper. You ask nothing. You simply watch as she adjusts one bundle half a turn and taps the top twice. The rhythm here is unmistakable. No one shouts, no one hurries, and yet everything changes in small, deliberate gestures. You become aware of your own breathing, how it matches the pace of things. Soft inhale, longer exhale, and as you pass a narrow stretch between 2 closely set stalls, you notice something small but precise, a single stone, marked with an X in chalk, sitting beside a pole but not part of any triangle. It might be waiting its turn. Or maybe it's retired. Either way, it has a presence. One stall features a rope hanging from the tarp's corner with shells tied in a cluster, tiny cowries. Some cracked. When the wind blows, they clink softly. You ask the vendor about it and she replies, when the shells chime, it's time to shift the shadow. A poetic way of saying, realign your stones. You feel the morning deepening now, birds louder, footfalls faster. The market hums, but still under control. You turn, and all at once, you see it, a stall in the middle. Unshaded, 3 stones in place but no tarp above. Just the promise of shade. Someone's missing, or late, or done for the day. Or maybe, just maybe, they trust the stones enough to hold a place. You walk past the stall with no tarp, just those 3 stones waiting patiently in their triangle. Like 3 elders sitting in silence. Something about it feels sacred. Or maybe just unfinished. Either way, you don't disturb it. Next to it is a younger vendor. Maybe 16, adjusting his shade with a method that feels less learned and more guessed. His triangle is slightly askew. One corner is wobbling. You see him pull a mango crate from under the table, plop down on it with a sigh, and stare up at the canvas like it's a misbehaving kite. Then he does something curious. He pulls out a book, not a phone, not a manual, but a book, thin, homemade, with pages bound by string. On the inside flap is a drawing of the market. Overhead view, with arrows sketched in pencil. Some of them swirl like wind currents. Others point straight toward compass directions. On one page, you spot a note written in blue ink, 3 stones. One shadow, anchor the spirit, not just the tarp. You don't ask. You just smile to yourself and keep walking. Procedural detail. In some regions of Fiji, especially along the southern coasts, it's common practice for vendors to trace a faint triangle in the earth before laying down their real stones, like a blueprint. This tradition, known as shadow casting, is said to help maintain alignment over long days of sun shift and breeze. The triangle is drawn using the tip of a coconut frond or the base of a sandal. Always by hand. You approach a pair of stalls side by side, run by what appears to be a married couple. Their stones match, same size, same shape, same finish, but the orientations are slightly different. You realize, they've made mirror triangles. A kind of visual rhyme. Her stall leans ever so slightly east. His, ever so slightly west. The shade overlaps in the middle. That's where their chairs are. They're sipping something warm from tin mugs and not speaking. Just sharing shade. A cork becomes evident at their feet, tiny pieces of cloth tied to each stone in bright red. Each cloth is stitched with a letter. ABC. You figure it's a personal labeling system. You figure wrong. Turns out, in that part of the island, some vendors still label their stones by song. The letters are notes. A triangle isn't just geometry, it's a chord. The alignment. A kind of music. You pause by a root vegetable seller who's humming something tuneless but steady. He's got a long stick with a hook on one end, which he uses not to sell, but to adjust his pole from a distance. The pole shifts, the rope tenses, and the stone nearest to you scoots an inch inward. It's mesmerizing, like a slow-motion puppeteer. Unresolved note. Some elders say a properly placed triangle can hold a memory. That is, even if the tarp is taken down, the area beneath will stay slightly cooler. Longer. No one's proved it, but vendors believe, and that's what matters. At the far end of the market, you see a kind of tools and fixes stall. Half repair shop, half supply depot. It's here that stones can be swapped. Not for money, but through barter. Sometimes even stories. A vendor holds up a stone and says, "This one's been to Sigatoka and back." Another replies, "Mine's from my grandmother's stall." No two stories match. That's part of the charm. A small board hangs on the post there, painted with this advice: use what holds. Keep what stays. Ask what lasts. You notice a strange item on the tool bench, a flat wooden triangle, painted with degree markings like a protractor. It's used by newer vendors to standardize their stone placements. You hear someone scoff. "We don't chart wind," they say. "We read it." You keep moving. At a coconut stall, the stones are large and smooth, almost too perfect. The vendor explains, she polishes them every Friday evening. It's become her ritual. She says it makes the shade feel calmer, more cooperative. You nod, not entirely sure how calmness interacts with sunlight, but willing to believe. Nearby, a child is helping his father shift a rope. He's holding a tiny wooden figure in one hand, a turtle, carved from driftwood. He keeps placing it on top of one of the corner stones like it's part of the system. Maybe it is, maybe it's just a lucky charm. But he taps the turtle twice before walking away, and the shade doesn't flutter once. Quirk. Older vendors sometimes balance a coin on the center stone before final adjustment. If the coin spins cleanly when flicked, it's said to indicate true balance. You spot this done once, quietly, almost secretively, like someone testing fate. You walk past a woman kneeling, whispering something as she pats down her last stone. Not a prayer, not quite, just words for the morning. You don't catch them, you weren't meant to, but as she finishes, she touches each corner once, clockwise, and stands. The breeze picks up then, nudging the shade just enough to cast a perfect rectangle over her table of handmade bracelets. The light dances between them. In that moment, it's hard to say what's anchoring what. You leave the bracelet vendor behind and drift toward the more crowded middle of the market, where the shade is layered, overlapping, patchy in some places and dense in others. It's like walking through a soft quilt made of wind and canvas. And everywhere beneath it, life happens at half speed. Not because people are lazy, but because they know the sun will wait. You pause at a stall selling woven mats, the kind with bold, geometric patterns in earthy reds and deep saffron. The vendor sits cross-legged behind her display, her feet bare, resting on a folded rice sack. Her shade anchors are unusual, 3 stones. Yes, but they're arranged inside a shallow wooden tray filled with sand. It's a mobile triangle, more art than tool. The tray has small seashells pressed into the corners. A factual procedural note: in inland markets where ground isn't sandy or soft, some vendors use floating anchors, wooden trays like these filled with gravel or river pebbles. The trick is in the proportion: 1/3 stone weight, 2/3 distribution. It prevents dragging without pinning too hard. The vendor offers you a smile that's more eyes than mouth. She taps one shell with a long stick, clack, clack, then reaches under her mat for a jug of water and splashes just a few drops on each stone. For connection, she says, but doesn't elaborate. You drift onward. There's a stall that's practically glowing. Strings of dried hibiscus hang along the awning, and under the shade, anchored by the usual 3 stones, are rows of hand-painted fans, all in indigo and gold. The stones here are painted, too, swirls and dots and vines, curling like the wind itself. Someone cared about how they looked, even if they never move. Just past it, a man in a teal sarong haggles gently over a bundle of greens. As he argues the price, he casually flicks his foot against one of the stones at the base of the stall. It shifts a half-inch and the tarp above him tenses ever so slightly, enough to let in more breeze. Negotiation, it turns out, is physical too. You reach a fork in the path. Left leads toward fish and meat. Where the air is sharp and salty, right leads to cloth and tools. Where the smells are dustier, tinged with wood oil, you go right. For now, a weaver's stall catches your eye. Not for its goods, but its triangle. The stones aren't stones at all. They're clay pots, inverted, each filled with something heavy, probably sand or shell. There's a ritual to their placement. The vendor taps each pot's rim before tightening the ropes that stretch from the tarp's corners. Obscure quirk. Some vendors use filled pots or bundled cloth sacks in place of stones. Especially in wet months when true stones are harder to find. But there's an old rule whispered among stallholders: never use all three substitutes. At least one must be a stone, or else, the shade forgets its shape. No one knows what forgetting looks like. No one wants to. You pause to drink from a coconut offered by a smiling child. No charge, just hospitality. The stall behind him has its triangle painted directly onto the ground in faded red dye, with each stone sitting squarely within its designated circle. It's less freeform, more mapped. Some might call it controlling. Others, secure. Another stall has a rope that's clearly too tight. The canvas above groans gently every time the wind picks up. The vendor notices you looking and shrugs with a wry smile. Stormproof, he says, though the sky is as calm as a sleeping cat. You nod. It's not always about the weather. Is it? There's a basket of extra stones near his feet, spares. He says, one is shaped like a heart. Another, like a teardrop. He says he doesn't use those. They're too dramatic. Then comes a stall where the triangle is marked not by stones, but by birds. 3 small ceramic doves sit at the points. Heavy enough to anchor, delicate enough to confuse. You ask if they're functional. The vendor says, everything's functional, until it isn't. A family stall next door is setting up late. The father loops a rope around the middle stone, a chunky thing with a deep scar across its side. The child helps by tightening the loop, then pats the stone 3 times. It's their version of a handshake. Procedural folklore. In some villages, it's said that patting a stone in odd numbers wakes it, while even numbers calm it. There are no instructions about this in any official guide. Still, most folks you ask have a preference. You step aside to let a cart pass, its wheels squeak. Its driver hums a tune about rain and bread. Behind it, another triangle catches your attention. It's drawn in chalk, delicate, already fading, with 3 rough stones placed like punctuation marks. A transient stall, maybe, or someone experimenting. Still, the tarp holds. You reach a bench shaded by 3 overlapping awnings. The stones of each triangle share a boundary, touching like neighbors at a fence. It's not perfectly aligned, but it works, and it looks communal. An unresolved thought floats by. Maybe the point of the triangle isn't precision. Maybe it's participation. You sit a while longer and watch the shade shift. Twist. Breathe. Not a cover. A companion. By now, you've adjusted to the rhythm of the market, the way the breeze seems to play a quiet game of tag with the tarps. How the ropes hum softly when they shift. And how each vendor seems to have a specific relationship with their shade. Like it's an old pet that sometimes cooperates, sometimes sulks. You rise from the bench and move toward a quieter aisle, near the outer edge of the square. Fewer stalls here, and more space between them. There's a scent of sweet bread drifting from somewhere, mixed with the powdery smell of crushed coral dust underfoot. A rooster crows half-heartedly in the distance, late to its own job. You stop at a stall selling nothing but small tools, wooden-handled knives, bundles of twine, hand-forged scissors with loops as wide as bracelets. The vendor, an older woman with a wide straw hat and paint on her fingers, nods at you once and keeps carving a pattern into a piece of driftwood. Her stones are stacked, not just placed, but built into mini pillars. 3 piles, 2 stones each, like stony snowmen with no faces. Factual detail. In some older market sections, especially where stalls are semi-permanent, Vendors opt for vertical anchoring, stacking 2 or more stones and looping ropes around the middle. It allows for greater tension without digging into the ground. Local manuals describe this as tiered anchoring, though most vendors just call it stacking. A teenage boy strolls past with a broom made of palm ribs, sweeping the aisle with slow, purposeful strokes. As he passes, he glances at the stacked stones and says, "Too tall." The woman doesn't reply, just taps one of the stacks with the back of her knife and continues carving. You wander onward, ducking slightly beneath a fraying awning. This shade is tired, torn at one corner, patched in another, fluttering with every breeze like it's waving you through. Its anchors are curious, 3 thick glass bottles filled with sand and capped with wax. The ropes tie around their necks like makeshift leashes. Quirk. For a brief period in the 1980s, there was a trend, especially among younger vendors, to use reclaimed materials as anchors. Bottles, bricks, even small ceramic flower pots filled with concrete. It was practical and personal, but not always reliable. One strong wind and the whole aesthetic could tumble sideways. You notice a group of children playing near a patch of shade cast by a mango cart. They're using flat stones as game pieces, sliding them across the dirt, trying to land closest to a drawn circle. You pause, watching the smooth rhythm of their throws. One child picks a triangle-shaped stone, kisses it for luck, and lets it fly. It lands dead center. Their grandmother calls them back to the stall, where she's selling jars of pickled green papaya. Her anchors are textbook, 3 clean basalt stones, each with a carved groove where the rope sits snug. The ropes themselves are dyed bright pink. For visibility, she says, but you suspect she just likes the color. Another vendor nearby does things differently. His triangle is so wide it stretches nearly into the next stall. You look closer. 2 stones are the standard round river rock type, but the third is a brick. A chipped, sun-worn brick with half a handprint pressed into one face. No one questions it. It holds. A procedural footnote, while not officially encouraged. Mixed anchor, triangles, those using at least one non-stone item, are tolerated in peripheral areas of Fijian markets, especially when ground softness or material shortage is an issue. However, the use of bricks is often met with quiet sighs from older vendors, something about breaking the line. The sun has shifted now, casting longer shadows and giving everything a faint golden tint. You see a stall where someone is adjusting their tarp in real time. She pulls the rope tighter on one side, then loosens the far edge by just a finger's width. The result? A perfect slope that channels wind just enough to keep the flies away. She notices you watching. "Every hour," she says. It moves a little, then adds with a smile, "So I move, too." Obscure note from a market manual dated 1964. Shade is a conversation, not a conclusion. Adjust frequently, or be forgotten. The quote is unattributed, but someone penciled next to it. Sounds like Tavo. You crouch beside one of her stones, a flat oval with a painted stripe of blue across its center. You reach out and touch it. It's warm, dry, smooth. There's a small nick on the edge, just big enough to feel with your fingertip. Unresolved note. Many vendors believe that a stone remembers its spot, that if you place it somewhere else, it might shift slightly overnight, like it's trying to go home. No one has proof, but sometimes, when the morning sun hits just right, you can see faint impressions in the dust where a stone used to be. You move along, past a spice stall where the anchor stones are hidden beneath burlap sacks, weighted in place with what smells like turmeric and coriander. The vendor waves but doesn't speak, his mouth busy with a wedge of pineapple. Farther down, you find a stall with no stones at all, just holes in the ground, each one lined with a ring of tightly packed mud. The ropes disappear into them. Embedded anchors, unmoving. The shade above doesn't ripple. It just hovers. You ask the vendor about it. He shrugs and says, "Permanent." His tone is both proud and vaguely resigned. As you prepare to head back toward the center, you pass a triangular formation unlike any other, 3 stones. Yes, but painted with symbols. One has a sunburst, another, a spiral, the third, a fish. You ask what they mean. The vendor grins and replies, "Depends who's asking." And somehow, That feels like the most accurate manual of all. You loop back toward the central avenue of the market now, where the crowd has thickened and the sun has climbed to its full voice, high and bright. Sharp enough to make your shoulders instinctively curl inward. But the shade triangles are doing their work. Tarps stretch like sails between stalls. Some bleached by years of exposure. Others vibrant with recently re-dyed blues, oranges, or deep reds. You pause beneath one of the larger triangles. The air feels cooler here, as though someone's turned the volume down on the heat. A small group gathers around a woman arranging coconuts in a perfect spiral. Her shade triangle is wide and low, pitched like a quiet whisper. One rope loops around the middle of a wooden wheel, repurposed as a stake. The 3 stones, heart-shaped, no less, are set just outside the wheel's rim. It's part geometry, part personality, factual detail, according to the 1978 Revised Vendor Handbook of Suva. Vendors are allowed to anchor shade extensions using either stones or wheel-embedded wooden support implements, provided no anchor crosses the public walking zone by more than 18 centimeters. This rule is enforced only on Tuesdays, though no one really knows why. The coconut seller nods toward her setup and says, "Triangles should never shout." She doesn't explain further, but somehow you know exactly what she means. As you turn the corner, you notice a commotion, gentle, but unmistakable. A tarp has collapsed, not violently, not loudly, but with the slow drama of something giving up its will. The vendor, a wiry man in a mustard-colored shirt, stares at the fallen canvas with mild defeat. A group of nearby vendors offers commentary without moving, told him not to skip the middle knot. Should have gone with coral rock. Ties too loose, no tension, no one laughs. This is practical sympathy, what you might call a manual in voices. They'll help him, of course. But first, the post-mortem. Quirk. There is a market superstition, particularly among fruit vendors, that skipping a knot or tying ropes too loosely invites tarp collapse karma. Often within 3 days, some even leave tiny bundles of ginger beside their anchors as a form of blessing. Whether it works is debatable, but you do notice the ginger. The man sighs and begins readying. He retrieves his stones, one had rolled slightly under a basket, and resets the triangle. This time, it's tighter, more symmetrical. One vendor tosses him a 4th stone, and he shakes his head. 3, he says, always 3. You stand beside a stall selling dyed fabric and hand-woven mats. The ropes here are almost decorative, braided with beads, wound in patterns before anchoring to deep black volcanic rocks that almost shimmer. The vendor sees you admiring them and says, "My daughter made these, said the wind should have something pretty to tug." You smile, then notice something unusual. One of the stones isn't real. It's carved wood, painted to match the others. You point at it. The vendor shrugs. "Stone cracked last week. No time to replace. Works for now." Then adds, "But don't tell the weather." An obscure note in a 1993 field manual drafted by a coastal vendor collective. When one anchor fails, do not panic. Substitute creatively, but do not grow attached to the substitute. The footnote adds, "We lost a whole tarp to a ceramic pig once." You watch as a light gust rolls through the market. Nothing dramatic, just enough to flutter the loose edges of a dozen tarps. The triangles sway, then settle, like a synchronized exhale. You approach a juice stand next. The shade here is lower than most, and as you duck beneath it, you notice the anchors are small, barely fist-sized stones tucked under the vendor's wooden bench. "Hidden, but solid," she says, just like good flavor. Her shade doesn't flap, it hums. There's a laminated chart beside her ice bucket, yellowed at the corners, printed with line drawings of rope placements and anchor positions. The top reads, "Personal Guide to Balance 2002. You recognize the triangle diagram from earlier stalls, but here it's been doodled on with pencil hearts and the word, mango, in the corner. She notices you looking and says, "That was my first market day. Still learning, still works." As you move back into the main stretch, the breeze picks up, and you see a tarp lift briefly at the edge before snapping back down with a soft pop. People barely react, just small adjustments. A tug on a rope, a nudge on a stone with a sandal, a reset of the angle. It's all muscle memory now. Procedural tip from an old training poster: wind is rarely rude. But it is persistent. Don't challenge it, invite it. You pass a stall where the triangle anchors are painted in pastel colors: lilac, seafoam, butter yellow. Each stone has a number painted on it. The vendor notices you looking and grins. I forget things. This helps me reset them right after rain. Practical, beautiful, undeniably human. And then you see something rare, a stall without a tarp at all. Just 3 stones in a triangle, sitting alone on bare ground. No ropes, no canvas. You raise an eyebrow. The vendor smiles from behind his basket of bananas and says, "Not for shade, just in case." Unresolved note: some vendors keep their triangle anchors set even when the tarp isn't up. They say it helps maintain balance. Or territory. Or maybe just tradition. No one agrees. No one minds. The sun dips slightly now. Shadows lengthen. And the market begins to soften at the edges. Some stalls start packing. Others prepare for afternoon trade. You hear the thump of a mallet driving a stake into firmer soil and the slide of rope through fingers practiced by decades. There's comfort here. A kind of symphony made of shade and stone and time. And still, always, 3. The afternoon settles in like a warm sigh. You feel it in your shoulders first. Then in your calves, which suddenly notice how long they've been wandering the rows. The light has changed, less about brilliance now, more about texture. Everything glows a little softer. Tarps that once seemed industrial now glow like aged linen under cathedral glass. You're near the end of one row when you spot a shade triangle that's not quite a triangle. It's off-center, more trapezoid than triangle. Really, though, if you called it that. The vendor might glare. One rope is looped through a carved driftwood pole. Not a normal stake. One stone is missing, replaced with a stack of 4 thick coins, held together with waxed thread. It looks precarious, but somehow, it works. Factual note: in a 1981 workshop on shade anchoring creativity, hosted by a Suva trade union, vendors were encouraged to explore culturally relevant substitutions in moments of spatial compromise. Coins, carved shells, flattened coral, and even wrapped bundles of pandanus leaves made the approved list. But all were expected to weigh at least 600 grams. You linger near this stall, watching as the vendor brews tea in a dented copper kettle. He doesn't sell anything, no products, no price signs, just shade, tea, and conversation. A few other vendors take turns sitting in his triangle, like it's a public bench. When you tilt your head, you notice a tiny cloth tag sewn into the tarp corner, for those who forgot their own shade today. A gesture, that's all it is, but it means more. Quirk: in parts of the Western Archipelago, there's an unspoken code: if your anchor fails, and someone lends you shade, you owe them a fruit or a story. Preferably both. One vendor once received an entire fish in repayment for a spare stone. She still talks about it. As you leave that space, you notice a tarp flapping more than the others. A corner has come loose. You expect a scramble, a reaction, but instead, the vendor simply walks over, hums a line from a folk tune, and picks up the fallen stone. She dusts it off, turns it in her hand like a river-smoothed secret, then places it back with a little more care than before. Nothing dramatic, just the quiet insistence that it matters. You step into a shaded aisle and find an old woman with a stall selling hand fans, woven palm fronds dyed with natural indigo and pomegranate skins. Her shade triangle is unusually low, almost pressing against her crates. Her stones are the smallest you've seen, no bigger than your palm. But her ropes are taut, deliberately tied with knots you don't recognize. She sees you looking and raises an eyebrow. Fishing knots, she says. Wind pulls different than water, but not by much. She gestures toward one of the stones. It's faintly carved. A date, 1972. You ask what it means. She shrugs. My first market. That stone hasn't moved since. Then adds, still holds, doesn't it? An obscure practice mentioned in a coastal trader's logbook from the early 70s. Some vendors bury a small charm beneath each anchor point during their first season, usually a carved bead, a shell button, or a braid of someone's hair, for luck, or memory, or just to feel like something's watching over the tarp. You move on and pass a stall where the vendor is adjusting her ropes again, not out of necessity, but with precision. She measures each angle with a folded paper guide, marked with fine lines and looping numbers. When asked, she says simply, "Symmetry helps sales." Her triangle is perfect. Her stall is immaculate. Her stones? Polished river rocks, stacked in identical bowls when not in use. You can't help but respect it, even if you'd never do it yourself. There's a sound now, a rhythmic thumping. You follow it until you reach a younger vendor pounding small holes in the ground with a flat wooden mallet. "New tarp," he says between thuds. "Inherited it from my uncle. Needs training." Training, that's what he calls it. And maybe he's right. Shade, after all, is not just installed, it's coaxed. Encouraged, reassured, he places each stone carefully. Not large ones, but 3 of similar weight and color. He pats them twice, once for balance, once for luck, then loops the ropes with the same rhythm, as if tying verses instead of knots. Unresolved note: no formal manual ever specifies the exact order in which to lay down your stones. Some start left to right. Some go clockwise. A few claim if you do it in silence, the tarp sets cleaner. But that's more myth than method. You're walking now through the quieter side of the market. The crowds have thinned. The shade triangles cast longer shadows. One vendor is sketching in the corner of a notebook. You peek. Diagrams of stone placements, wind angles, even annotations like, "Don't trust southern breeze after 3 p.m. A procedural aside printed in a 2005 vendor leaflet reads, "Your stones should learn your habits. Do not move them unnecessarily." The writer, uncredited, was likely a poet. The final triangle you see today is strange in the best way. It's more open, almost like wings mid-flap. One stone is bright blue, painted with a fish motif. One is obsidian dark, glossy and square. The third? A coconut shell filled with sand, sealed with resin. You stare. The vendor notices. Balance isn't always symmetrical, he says. It's just honest. That lands somewhere deep in your chest. The sky begins to pale now. Not from weather but from time. You feel the sun's grip loosen. The air grow thicker with memory. And as you step away from the rows of anchored triangles and sun-warmed stone, you carry something invisible but anchored, too. Because now, you know, 3 stones, and the story they hold. The walk back through the market feels different now. You've seen so many variations, some improvised, others obsessively perfect, and the 3-stone rule has begun to settle in your mind like a gentle proverb. There's comfort in it, in the rhythm of 3, in the way 3 points make something stand, even when everything else is in motion. You pass a vendor recoiling her ropes with practiced ease. She hums to herself, a tune without lyrics, and her fingers move fast, wrapping and tucking the hemp as if she's done it in her sleep. Her stones are wrapped in cloth when not in use. Blue linen, faded and frayed, but neatly tied with a sailor's knot. A detail most would miss. Some vendors don't like to let their stones touch the ground when they're not anchoring. They treat them more like tools than weights. Or maybe like ancestors. Nearby, a small boy is trying to help his grandfather secure the final corner of a stall. The tarp keeps flapping. The stone keeps tipping. The boy looks frustrated, but instead of scolding, the old man laughs, then swaps out the stone for a flatter one. Just slightly heavier. Not every stone fits every ground, he says. A procedural tip printed on the back of a laminated training sheet from 1996. When in doubt, switch for flatter geometry before adding weight. It's sensible, practical, and quietly poetic, if you think about it. You keep walking. A little further down, there's a woman with a wooden box of backup stones. She's not using them, just showing them to a curious tourist. Each is labeled in neat ink, wet season, windy Tuesday, for singing tarps, do not use, bad vibes. She smiles as she closes the lid, then gently touches the 3 stones already anchoring her shade. They don't match, but they belong together. Quirk. There's an old tale passed between vendors about a man who used 4 stones once. Just once. The story never agrees on what happened. His stall blew away, or it caught fire, or his pineapples all soured, but the message remains. 3 is trust. 4 is asking for trouble. You pass a painted sign staked into the ground. Not official, not government issued, just handwritten in faded ochre. Tie it twice, stone it thrice, shade will stay till sunset. You pause to take that in. Someone thought it mattered enough to write. To stake, to share. It's not part of any ordinance. It's not enforced. But there it is, like folklore pinned to the earth. Behind the sign is a stall you hadn't noticed before. No products, just shade, and a wooden bench, empty but inviting. You sit, for just a minute, to listen. The wind talks here, through rope and fabric and shifting weight. The flaps of tarps sound like sails in the distance. The stones don't move. They don't need to. The angles have been rehearsed so many times. The whole structure hums with memory. Across from you, a young woman smooths out a map of the island. She's not selling it, just fixing a corner that's curled up. Underneath, 3 stones hold it still, different from tarp stones. Smaller, but placed with the same reverence. She sees you looking and offers a simple explanation. Same rules. Different shade. You nod. Another unresolved note. Some vendors claim they can tell the weight of a stone just by the way it sounds when tapped with a fingernail. They'll tap 3 times and say, "That's a mango storm stone." Or, "Too light for August." Whether it's true or not doesn't really matter. It's the belief that holds. The sun has begun its slow slide now. You can feel it in the angle of the shadows. In the warm grit beneath your shoes. In the subtle loosening of the air. Some vendors have started packing up. Others are sitting with a cup of tea or a fruit peeled halfway. You notice many don't move their stones until the last minute. Some not at all, because even when the shade isn't needed, the balance still is. As you stand, you see one last triangle, this one formed more by memory than materials. The ropes are frayed, the tarp is patched, the stones are worn so smooth they shine. But it's holding, not by force, by habit, like a story told the same way, night after night, until it becomes part of the land. You take one last breath, of sea salt and cooked yams and iron-rich dust, and it lingers. You don't need to understand every rule. Just that they exist. Just that someone, once, decided 3 stones was enough to make something stand. And thousands agreed. Quietly, repeatedly, lovingly. You walk away slowly. The corners of your mind still held in place by invisible threads and softly weighted memories. Because shade, here, is more than shelter. It's intention. You're back at the far edge of the market now, the quiet end. Where stalls thin out and shade structures grow a little looser. A little more improvisational. Here, the 3-stone setup is still followed. But there's a certain flair to it. Like jazz. If jazz were about tarps and wind resistance. One shade is propped using stones painted with faded blue dots, almost like constellations. Another uses stones tied with thick twine bows. These vendors aren't just anchoring against the wind, they're making little declarations. Maybe not of rebellion, but definitely of personality. You pass a man sitting cross-legged next to his stall. He's sharpening a knife on a flat river stone, clearly not one of the anchor trio. But still from the same family. Next to him, a younger vendor is testing shade tension with her elbow, bouncing it lightly like a drum. She nods to herself, then nudges one of her stones a centimeter forward. You hear the rope tighten. That was all it took. A procedural line from the 1972 Lautoka vendor handbook. Shifting a shade stone should not exceed 5 centimeters in any single adjustment. To avoid stress over correction. It's a sentence that feels oddly profound for something so mechanical. You imagine someone cross-stitching it onto a market apron. There's a stack of taro leaves being sorted by hand nearby. The woman arranging them hums the same 3-note melody with every bundle she stacks, quiet and rhythmic. Like a lullaby for the produce. Her tarp barely moves in the breeze. Anchored by stones shaped like miniature shields. Each chipped on one corner like they've seen battle. Maybe they have. Quirk. It's believed, by at least a dozen vendors, that a stone used under a full moon holds better balance. Not because of gravity, just because. One man even marks his with tiny crescent moons using ash from his cooking fire. A soft laugh draws your attention. It's a group of older vendors leaning against a crate of bananas. All watching as a new vendor attempts to anchor her first shade. She fumbles a bit with the knots. Overtensions the center rope. and one side of the tarp flutters wildly in protest. They don't interrupt, just nod and sip tea. Everyone has to learn by tugging too hard once. The new vendor sighs, undoes the middle rope, and tries again, this time leaving a little slack. The tarp settles. The oldest vendor raises his cup in silent approval. That's how lessons are given here, not with lectures, but with presence. A procedural diagram sketched on the back of a sugar sack, a triangle with arrows pointing inward. Labeled, tension wants center. Stones want peace. The visual is crude, but the message is crystal clear. Don't fight your shade, work with it. You crouch near one of the stones and run your fingers over it. It's warm, like it remembers the morning. The bottom is still damp from the earth. And there's a pressed flower stuck to one side, accidental. Maybe, but beautiful. Another stall's stones are carved, not deeply. Just shallow runes. Some look like letters, others like waves or fish. When you ask about them, the vendor smiles and says, "No meaning anymore, just history." She shrugs, but that still counts. Behind her, a small board is nailed to a tree trunk. It has only one sentence, written in red ink that's nearly faded away, "Always leave space for the breeze." You think about how many meanings that could have. Someone whistles nearby, not loud, just enough to suggest amusement. You turn to see a pair of teens trying to balance a fourth stone on a friend's back while he lies face down under a shade. It tips off almost immediately. They laugh. Then someone older, probably an uncle, throws a sandal at them from another stall and shouts, "Freeze enough. Don't tempt the sun." The mood is easy here. Soft-spoken. Everyone moves with the same quiet tempo. Tie. Check. Adjust. Sit. Sometimes repeat. But not rushed. Never rushed. One unresolved whisper from the market. Some say the three-stone rule was a joke at first. A kind of playful dare turned tradition. But no one remembers who made the first triangle. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was just the only way that ever worked. What matters is that it stayed. You glance around and realize the market is full of triangles, not just tarp anchors. The layout of stalls, the way ropes stretch to trees or posts, the placement of baskets, all arranged to create little pockets of balance. As if the vendors don't just follow the manual, they live inside it. Someone lights a small cooking fire. The smoke curls upward, hits the underside of a tarp, then slips sideways through a gap, perfectly engineered by the angle of the shade. You wonder if that, too, was planned. You're about to move on when a child tugs your sleeve. She points to a basket filled with round, flat stones, extras, she says, for when it gets jealous. You don't ask what it is. Some things are better left in the folklore. The air feels heavier now. The kind of heat that clings rather than scorches. Vendors splash water at the edges of their space, tamping down dust. One stone is half buried now, as if choosing to stay forever. Maybe it will. You take a final look around. Every stall, every rope, every trio of stones, different, but somehow the same, unified by a rule that isn't enforced but deeply, quietly believed. 3 stones, not because someone said so, but because it works. You turn down the central spine of the market again, this time paying close attention to the sound of things. The squeak of pulley knots sliding under tension. The rhythmic flap of tarpaulin edges that never quite settle. A spoon against the rim of a tin cup. Someone humming something that might be a hymn. Or just a weather forecast disguised as melody. The stones here, these modest, unassuming guardians of shade, don't make much noise. But they shape the silence. Every secure corner of cloth, every perfectly angled flap, owes its hush to those stones. There's a dignity in their stillness. You almost bow to one. Then think better of it. You're trying to blend in. After all, one procedural detail from a rarely seen 1983 vendor training pamphlet, for greatest balance. Stone number 3 must never be placed directly in the sun's anticipated path. It is the quiet stone, the one that absorbs rather than resists. It's phrased like philosophy. You wonder if a poet slipped that into the manual. You pass a tea vendor whose stall is shaded by a dark blue tarp that moves like velvet when the wind catches it. Her stones are square, not round, and each one sits atop a folded piece of burlap, probably to protect both the ground and the stone. She offers you a cup of something faintly herbal. You accept. It tastes like citrus and dusk. She gestures toward her stones and says, each one named after an uncle. The stubbornest is Tico. You ask which one Tico is. The one that always moves after I turn my back. You smile, but she's not joking. Not entirely. There's a tarp nearby with a fourth rope. But no fourth stone. Instead, the vendor has wedged the rope into the fork of a banana tree. It works, barely. You can tell the tarp's tension is off by just a few degrees. Enough that it hums instead of resting. The vendor notices you noticing and says, only had 2 stones this morning. Borrowed one. Tree had to earn its keep. A rare note found in the 1991 Shade Cooperative Guidelines mentions a clause about non-stone anchoring substitutes, including tree roots, bricks, and grandchildren willing to stay still. That last part was likely added in jest, but no one ever removed it. You catch sight of a stall in the distance, different from the rest. Instead of a tarp, it uses layers of woven mats tied together, like patchwork fabric in the sky. The 3 stones below are equally unconventional. One is shaped like a foot, another like a leaf, and the third is just a bundle of smaller stones tied in a fishing net. You walk closer and hear someone inside the stall whisper, balance is about mass, not shape. It sounds like they've said it many times before. Under the shade, a wooden crate bears a hand-scrawled list of acceptable substitute weights. You read the top line, 1/2 bag of salt, dry. 1 cooking pot with lid, full. Or 1 very cooperative cat. You don't ask about the cat. Some knowledge is earned, not given. An older vendor approaches, wearing a sun-bleached shirt the color of mango skin. He offers no greeting, just bends down and adjusts one of his stones. You hear a faint creak in the rope above. Then he nods, satisfied. The shade settles an inch lower. Shade, perfected. He looks at you, gestures to the stone, and says, this one was my mother's. From her first stall. You ask if it's always worked. He shrugs. Not always, but when it doesn't, it teaches. That feels like the kind of lesson you can't put in a manual. Quirk. There's a quiet superstition among the vendors that if you lose one of your shade stones, the other 2 will refuse to hold. As if the triangle, once broken, mourns its missing point. Some claim this is nonsense. Others sleep with their 3rd stone under their bed when not in use. Just in case. You sit near a row of eggplants laid out like dark purple commas, their glossy skin reflecting slices of shade. You notice the pattern of the ropes now, how each is tied with a knot that isn't just practical but specific. There's the fisherman's loop, the double twist, the slant tuck. You wonder if the knots are passed down the same way as the stalls. One vendor, younger than most, is clearly still learning. She's tying and untying the same rope again and again, trying to get the knot just right. Her mother watches, arms crossed but smiling. The girl finally gets it. Tug, twist, loop, tighten, and the shade sighs downward like it's grateful. A chalkboard behind them reads, 3 stones, 3 knots, 3 breaths. Begin. You suspect it's more than a checklist, it's a rhythm. Someone lights a lantern near their feet. Even though it's not dark yet. Maybe for bugs. Maybe just because it feels good. The flame flickers inside a glass jar, casting warped light onto the stones nearby. You watch how the light dances over their surfaces, uneven, dimpled, but trustworthy. You lean back against a stack of crates. The smell of coconut husk and market dust settling around you like a blanket. All this for shade, all this for calm. An unresolved whisper floats by. Someone once tried to use 4 stones and had their entire stall collapse. Not from wind, but from imbalance. Too much symmetry, one elder said, made the shade confused. You don't question it. You're not here to rewrite the manual. You're here to witness the quiet engineering of everyday life. And maybe, just maybe, learn what kind of anchor you'd be. You stay seated a moment longer, soaking in the rhythm of the place. The quiet isn't complete silence, it's more like a blanket woven from soft sounds. The rustle of cloth, the faint thud of fruit being shifted, the occasional muttered blessing as someone adjusts a tarp. There's comfort in the repetition, in the modest choreography of daily setup. A procedural detail from a training booklet printed in 1976. Still occasionally spotted in plastic sleeves, before anchoring. Gently rotate each stone counterclockwise 3 times for surface engagement. No one does that anymore. But some old vendors claim it warms the stone's mood. Whether that's physics or folklore depends on whom you ask. Across from you, a stall with bright yellow bananas has a different anchoring trick. Instead of cloth ropes, they use vines, thick, green, and pliant, tied to hand-drilled holes in flat stones that look like they were pulled straight from a riverbed. It works beautifully. The shade moves with a slow sway, not rigid like the tarps nearby, but flowing like fabric held in a dream. You walk past and notice the vendor's hands, covered in thin calluses but gentle. Like someone who's braided vines and cradled children in the same breath. She offers you a piece of dried pineapple. Says nothing. Her smile says enough. Nearby, a young boy is playing with an unused stone. He's drawing in the dust with its edge, making looping patterns that fade as the wind brushes them away. A quirk emerges from this simple play. Many vendors believe the unused fourth stone absorbs wandering intentions. If you touch it without a purpose, it takes something from you, a plan, a thought, a line of a song, and tucks it away in its cool silence. The boy doesn't seem to mind. He laughs, drops the stone with a thunk, and races after a rolling orange. The stone remains, now marked with a single smudge of fingerprint, which you somehow know won't fade until the next rain. You pass a shaded stall with no vendor in sight. Just 3 perfectly spaced stones holding down corners of a folded palm leaf canopy. At first glance, it looks abandoned, but then, you notice a note pinned to the middle rope, "Gone to fetch papaya." Stones will vouch for me. It's not official, but it's understood. The stall will remain untouched. The stones speak on the vendor's behalf. A passerby straightens one of the ropes. Just slightly. No one says anything, but you catch the faintest nod of appreciation from a nearby elder, sitting quietly under a straw hat that covers most of their face. You pass another vendor with an unusual method. Instead of resting the stone directly on the ground, she's placed each one on a wooden disc. Like a miniature stage, the stones look ceremonial now, like offerings. She notices your gaze and shrugs. "I don't like dirt on my rope," she says. Ropes got feelings too. A procedural addendum, penned in red ink on the back of a 1984 Shade Council memo, if elevation is required due to soil dampness. Acceptably flat surfaces may include coconut shell halves, dried breadfruit slabs, or smooth roof tiles. You suspect the author had a poetic streak, or a very wet stall. As the light begins to slant, the colors shift. Bright blues turn dusky. The greens of produce deepen. The tarps filter sunlight now, casting each stall in a unique tint. One looks golden, another pale lavender, another as green as mint tea. You walk through them like stained glass come alive. You stop at a stall where the stones are wrapped in cloth, each one bound like a gift. The vendor explains. They're cracked, but still good. Cloth keeps them together. You lean down and touch one gently. The crack runs clean through, but the cloth is tight. It holds. Some people patch things, others preserve the break. Unresolved curiosity. No one knows who first decided 3 stones was the rule. Some say it was based on the triangular geometry of shade tension. Others say it was because a 4th stone would tempt the spirits of imbalance. The manuals never confirm either. They just present diagrams and assume compliance. As you continue, you notice a stall with no tarp at all. Just 3 stones, arranged in a perfect triangle on bare earth. No ropes, no shade, just presence. The vendor sits in the center, eyes closed, as if meditating. You hesitate to interrupt. When she finally speaks, it's without opening her eyes. "This is for remembering," she says. "I had a tarp once. It blew away during the 1998 storm. Never replaced it. The stones stayed. They anchor memory now." A soft breeze passes through. The stones don't move. You feel something shift in your chest. Maybe gravity, maybe gratitude. One last stall catches your eye as you circle back toward where you started. The stones are painted, just faintly, with tiny white dots. Patterns you don't recognize. The vendor sees you looking and explains. "Star charts. My grandfather's idea. Said if you line the stones up just so, you can read the sky from below." You ask if it works. She laughs. "Only when you're sleepy. That You understand. You sit again, close to where you first entered the market. The sun's lower now, shadows stretching, breeze gentler. The rhythm hasn't stopped, just slowed. A knot is tied, a tarp flaps once, a stone is nudged back into place. And just like that, you feel it, the quiet triumph of everyday systems. Nothing flashy, nothing loud, just 3 stones, a bit of rope, and an unshakable belief in shade. You stay there a while longer, just watching. It's the kind of stillness that doesn't demand attention, just offers it, like a soft-spoken teacher letting silence do the heavy lifting. The vendors are beginning to settle into the rhythm of the day. Some hum quietly, some polish their weighing scales with folded cloth, some sip tea from chipped enamel cups, the kind with a rim of rust that never quite goes away. You lean back, noticing the angle of a tarp shifting ever so slightly as the sun moves. One vendor steps forward and tugs a rope gently, adjusting the tension so the corner dips a little lower, just enough to keep the sun out of her eyes. She doesn't even look at the stones. She knows they'll hold. One factual note from the 1993 Shade Management for Island Markets Handbook: the ideal stone weight per anchor point shall fall between 3.1 and 4.8 kilograms. To avoid either rope strain or foot stub hazard, you suspect most people have never weighed their stones in their life. They just know by feel, by sound, by how their grandmother used to grunt when lifting it. Across the way, a vendor is arguing, not loudly, just with emphasis, with someone about whether the front edge of the tarp should be pegged or left floating. It's an old debate. One side says pegged keeps the wind from flipping corners. The other side says pegging traps heat. There's no right answer, which is why the manuals offer both options but in separate appendices. Depending on prevailing breeze behavior. You overhear one man say, "My tarp breathes better unpegged." The other replies, "So do fish." But that doesn't mean they don't like still water. You have no idea what it means. But the conversation ends there. So maybe that's the point. At a nearby stall, a woman is refilling her water jug. The jug's resting on one of her anchor stones, a flat, oval one with a small chip on the edge that makes it look like a bitten cookie. She pours the water with care, spilling none, which might not seem impressive unless you've tried doing it while crouched. Half in shade, balancing against market chatter and the occasional chicken underfoot. The jug slips slightly, and she catches it just in time. She pats the stone afterward. A small thank you. She doesn't think anyone sees it. But you do. The gesture is tender, and ancient, and entirely practical. You pass a trio of boys helping their grandfather set up his stall. They carry each stone with both hands. Despite the fact that the stones aren't particularly big, it's the ceremonial part that matters. He lets them each choose where to place one. The middle boy lines his up with military precision. The youngest drops his with a flourish and announces, "That one's in charge." A quirk appears here, one passed down in whispered instructions and not in print. Assign each stone a name in your head. The stones listen better when you treat them like people. You've heard stranger advice, and you've seen people follow it with surprising devotion. A tarp flutters. A bird lands near one of the anchor points, hops twice, and then flies away. The rope doesn't flinch. The stone doesn't budge. The shadow beneath stays put, steady and soft, like a story you've heard so many times that the ending still feels right. You pause beside a stall that looks a bit newer, fresh canvas. Bright produce, clean ropes. The vendor, a young woman with a determined squint, has clearly read the manual front to back. She's used measured loops, color-coded her tie points, even brushed her stones clean before placing them. They glint in the sunlight like tumbled marble. But there's still a wobble in one corner. She's watching it, biting her lip. You don't say anything. This is her lesson to learn. Maybe tomorrow she'll move the left stone closer to the midpoint. Maybe she'll ask an older vendor. Or maybe the wind will teach her gently. That's how the system works. Manuals give you the start. The market teaches you the rest. You pass a stall that's closed for the day. 3 stones remain, still tied to their spots, like dogs waiting patiently for their person to return. The tarp is folded neatly, placed just beside them, weighed down with a bowl turned upside down. A note written in neat, slanted script says simply, Back tomorrow. Don't untie. The light shifts again. You feel it as much as see it. There's something about the way the shadows start to stretch a little longer now, hugging the backs of crates and curling beneath the feet of shoppers. The day isn't ending yet, but it's begun to lean. One last factual sidebar. The revised 2011 guidelines from the Regional Shade Regulation Committee included a line stating, when storing anchor stones overnight, avoid stacking more than 2 high unless secured with interweaving rope technique as described in Diagram C. The rope technique, as you later learn, involves a figure 8 knot with a reverse tuck. Only 3 vendors still use it. Back at your original seat, a vendor waves to you from across the lane. He gestures to a free mango on the corner of his table. Nods once. You walk over and take it gently. It's warm from the sun. Skin dimpled, fragrant. He doesn't speak, doesn't need to. Before you go, you glance at his stones. One is oddly shaped, lopsided and textured like old coral. Another has a handle carved into the top. The third, curiously, has a word etched into it, wait. An unresolved footnote. Some believe the worded stones are lucky. Others think they're burdens. No one agrees. The manuals never mention them. Maybe they're part of a different system altogether. Maybe that's how it should be. You take one last look around, memorizing the map of shade, rope, and quiet ingenuity. It's not a grand scene, but it's enough. Just enough to keep the sun off your back. Just enough to make you feel like the world is, at least in this little corner, working the way it should. The market has reached that golden lull, the one between the mid-morning flurry and the lunchtime drift. You notice the pace of everything slowing slightly. Voices lower, footsteps soften, even the wind seems to sigh instead of blow. Vendors lean against their stalls or crouch to adjust a corner of tarp. But mostly, they just rest. Your attention shifts to a stall that, earlier, felt too busy to study. Now it sits calmly. Its 3 stones perfectly spaced, each tied with weathered rope looped into a familiar pattern. The center rope has a slight twist to it, unintentional. Probably, but the stone at the end sits so solid, so still, it might as well be part of the earth. There's something comforting about the geometry of it all. Rope, knot, stone, angle. It's not just shade, it's intention. One factual detail worth noting, though no one says it aloud, in 1976, a small local council in northern Viti-Levu tried to pass a bylaw mandating permanent concrete footings for shade structures in markets. The idea was to modernize anchor systems. It was rejected unanimously. The minutes read, market shade must remain flexible, repositionable, and, where possible, poetic. You chuckle softly. Poetic. That's the word. Because how else do you describe a system built from smooth rocks and memory? Nearby, an elderly man adjusts his setup. He doesn't bend so much as pivot slowly, lowering his hand to nudge one stone half an inch. No tape measure, no fuss, just instinct. He's probably done it 1,000 times. Maybe 10,000. He hums as he works, a tune that never resolves. That's the point. One of the ropes near him has been dyed faintly blue. Maybe on purpose, maybe just old color leaching from fabric over time. A quirk. Certainly. Another rope has a knot that no one under 50 seems to know how to tie. A soft, looping thing that resembles a sleeping snail. It holds tighter with tension, looser with slack. A vendor once described it as the knot that listens. A breeze picks up. A single sheet of paper flutters across the aisle and lands face down near a cluster of vendor stones. No one rushes to grab it. Eventually a woman leans over, picks it up, reads it. It's a torn page from a children's notebook, someone's spelling list. Carefully, she folds it and tucks it under one of her stones. There's no ceremony, just the quiet preservation of something that doesn't belong to her, but doesn't need to be discarded either. There's a boy now, maybe 6 or 7, drawing with a stick in the dust near the base of a tarp. He circles each stone like it's a planet, connects them with lines, then turns the whole design into what might be a turtle. Or a spaceship. Depends on how you tilt your head. You realize something then. These stones aren't just anchors for fabric. They're quiet holders of time, of repetition, of small, deliberate decisions, and somehow, they make you feel steadier just by being nearby. One more oddity. a small metal tag tied to one rope. It reads, "Property of Stall 9. There's no Stall 9, not anymore. The number was retired years ago when the old layout shifted. But the tag remains. It clinks softly in the wind, not calling attention to itself. Just waiting. An unresolved mystery. Then, who made the first freestone system? The oldest vendors shrug when asked. It was always like this, they say. Some think it started with a woman who used cooking stones from her hearth, back when the market was just a few palm leaves and a mat. Others say it came from a fishing net system, weights for drying tarps at sea, adapted to land. Whatever the origin, it stuck. Because it worked. Because it was easy to teach. Because no one ever really needed more than 3. Now the day is tilting again. The shadows growing longer. The market quieter still. Some stalls have already begun packing up. A couple of ropes go slack. A stone is lifted, gently, and placed in a cloth bag. Another vendor wraps her stones in old newspaper and tucks them into a basket next to leftover breadfruit. But not all the stones move. Some are left in place. Corners of the tarps tied around them like tucked-in children. The vendors will be back tomorrow. And the stones will wait. You walk one final loop around the market. Not hurried, just drifting. You see vendors nodding goodbye with eyebrows and chin tilts. One offers you a slice of something sweet and sticky, wrapped in banana leaf. You accept it, because it feels rude not to. You carry it in your palm like a soft promise. By the far edge of the market, beneath a slanted bit of corrugated tin, someone has pinned a hand-drawn diagram to the wall. It's yellowed, the corners curled, a sketch of 3 stones, a triangle of rope, a tarp drawn in dotted lines. In the corner, someone has written, "If it falls." It was never balanced. You look at the diagram, then at the market, and you smile. Because it didn't fall. Because for one whole day, 3 stones were enough. The sun sinks low behind the hills, the heat releasing its grip on the ground like a slow exhale. Around you, the market breathes out with it. The ropes slacken, the stalls fold inward, and the stones, those steady, sun-warmed pieces of certainty, rest again. There's a quietness now, not of silence, but of things being finished. A rhythm has played out. The same rhythm it played yesterday. The same one it will hum again tomorrow. You imagine the feel of the stones in your hand, smooth, heavy, reliable. You picture each knot, each loop, each tiny adjustment made by fingers that trust what they know. Nothing hurried, nothing uncertain. And as the colors of the day fade into the soft lilacs and blues of evening, you let your breath match the slow tempo of the cooling earth. Let the memory of fabric fluttering and ropes creaking become background music. Let the stillness settle in your bones. Because here, in the shade of 3 stones, the world can feel held. The kind of held that asks nothing from you. The kind that says, simply, rest.